They say an alpha queen never breaks, that loyalty runs deeper than blood, that the bond between royal wolves is unbreakable as stone. But here's what they don't tell you about queens who hold empires together while their kings chase glory elsewhere. When they finally walk away, the entire kingdom burns. This is the story of Queen Selene Ardyn, the woman who vanished from the most powerful throne in the continent and brought an empire to its knees. Stay with me until the end of this saga. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I know where my tribe is watching from. Because what you're about to witness will shatter everything you thought you knew about power, loyalty, and the cost of loving a king who forgot how to see you. The morning Queen Selene Ardyn decided to disappear, she woke at dawn to the sound of her husband's laughter drifting through the palace corridors. Not directed at her, never at her anymore. She lay beneath silk sheets heavy as guilt, staring at the cathedral ceiling of their royal chamber while frost patterns spread across the windows like cracks in glass. Her body ached from another sleepless night spent reviewing grain ledgers and trade routes, while the rest of the palace celebrated another military victory she'd had no part in planning. The laughter came again. Vaelor's voice, rough and warm, the way it used to sound when he whispered against her throat in the early days of their bonding, before the conquest consumed him, before Lady Seraphine Vael arrived from the northern provinces with her silver eyes and strategic brilliance that made generals weep with admiration. Selene closed her eyes and counted her breaths the way her mother taught her years ago, back when she was just a daughter of House Ardyn instead of a queen slowly eroding beneath the weight of invisible labor. One breath. The treaty with the grain merchants needed signing before midday, or the southern provinces would face starvation by winter's end. 2 breaths. The hospital supplies required rerouting because the main trade road had collapsed during last week's storm, and nobody else seemed to notice or care. 3 breaths. Her husband was in love with another woman, and the entire empire pretended not to see it happening in plain sight. She rose from bed and dressed herself. No servants this morning. She needed the familiar ritual of lacing her own corset, pinning her own hair, fastening the heavy ceremonial collar that marked her as Vaelor's bonded queen. Her fingers shook slightly as she worked the clasps. Not from weakness, from the terrible clarity that comes when a woman finally stops lying to herself about what she's become. The mirror showed her a stranger, still beautiful in the way royal bloodlines are engineered to be beautiful. High cheekbones, dark eyes that used to flash with fire during council debates before she learned that speaking cost her more than silence ever did. Skin pale from too many nights spent buried in administrative work that kept the empire functioning while her king chased glory, and the brilliant strategist who understood warfare like poetry. She touched her reflection's face and wondered when she'd become so good at disappearing while standing directly in front of people. The Festival of Embers had been 3 days ago. 3 days since Vaelor walked into the grandest celebration of the year with Seraphine at his side, while Selene followed 3 steps behind like a discarded shadow. 10,000 nobles witnessed it. Not one spoke up. Powerful kingdoms breed silent witnesses. People who recognize cruelty but swallow their objections because confronting authority is dangerous and complicity is comfortable. She'd stood in that ballroom wearing diamonds heavy enough to bruise her collarbones and smiled through the humiliation because that's what queens do. They endure. They forgive. They transform degradation into grace because the alternative is admitting the bond was a lie, and the love was conditional, and the partnership was always about utility instead of devotion. But something had broken that night. Not her heart. Hearts are resilient and foolish and capable of forgiving almost anything. What broke was deeper. The fundamental illusion that sacrifice without acknowledgement was strength, that loyalty could survive invisibility, that crowns automatically deserved the devotion of the people wearing them. Selene left the royal chambers and walked through corridors still dark with pre-dawn shadow. Her footsteps echoed against marble floors worn smooth by centuries of rulers who probably faced similar reckonings and chose differently. Chose to stay. Chose to endure. Chose to believe that time would restore what neglect had eroded. She was done choosing that path. The council chambers stood empty at this hour. She moved through the space, touching surfaces she'd memorized over 6 years of marriage. The oak table where she'd presented dozens of solutions to crises nobody else noticed forming. The chair positioned slightly below and to the right of the king's throne, a subtle architectural choice that telegraphed hierarchy more efficiently than any proclamation. The windows overlooking the eastern gardens where she used to watch Vaelor train with his commander's back when he still sought her opinions about strategy and listened when she spoke about the Empire's vulnerabilities. Before Seraphine, before everything became about conquest and expansion and the intoxicating validation of a woman who understood military theory the way Selene understood food distribution networks and medical supply chains and all the invisible infrastructure that kept civilizations alive. She pulled the grain crisis ledger from its shelf and laid it open on the table. Weeks of work documented in her own handwriting. The corruption she'd uncovered. The solution she'd engineered. The disaster she'd prevented through sheer relentless attention to details powerful men considered beneath their notice. Yesterday's council meeting replayed in her memory with perfect, cruel clarity. She'd presented the findings, explained the scope of the theft, outlined the fix that would save half the Empire from starvation. Vaelor had listened with that distant expression he wore whenever she spoke about administrative matters. Not hostile, just absent, physically present, but mentally elsewhere. Then he'd turn to Seraphine. "What is your opinion?" 4 words that ended a marriage more efficiently than infidelity ever could. Not because he valued another woman's strategic mind. Selene could forgive intellectual attraction, but because in that moment, in front of the entire council, he'd made visible what had been happening invisibly for months. He demonstrated that her labor was expected, her solutions were assumed, and her presence was so thoroughly taken for granted that even her victories required validation from someone else before they became real to him. The room had gone silent. 15 council members suddenly fascinated by the grain patterns in the table wood. Nobody meeting her eyes. Nobody speaking up. Just the terrible quiet of witnesses who recognize injustice but lack the courage to name it. She'd closed the ledger, risen from her chair, looked at the most powerful king in 5 territories and felt absolutely nothing. Then let her rule your empire. She'd left before anyone could respond. Walked out of the council chambers with her spine straight and her face calm and her hands steady despite the earthquake happening beneath her ribs. That was yesterday. Now she stood in the empty room and made her decision. The palace began stirring as first light broke across the capital. Selene moved through her morning routine with mechanical precision. She attended the sunrise briefing with the head steward and transferred all her administrative codes and merchant contacts. She visited the royal archives and copied key documents onto pages she would take with her. She wrote instructions for the grain crisis resolution and left them where they'd be found. Then she returned to the royal chambers one final time. Vaelor was still absent, probably in the strategy rooms with Seraphine planning the next territorial expansion. Or maybe in her private quarters. Selene didn't let herself imagine that possibility. Some wounds don't need deeper investigation. She removed the crown from its velvet stand. Heavy thing. Gold and rubies and the weight of 6 years spent trying to be worthy of a man who'd stopped noticing her the moment someone more stimulating entered his orbit. She set it on the bed. Beside it, she placed the royal seal that gave her authority over domestic policy. And finally, she laid down a letter written in black ink on white parchment. "You loved my silence because it made your life easier. You mistook my endurance for infinite mercy. An empire can survive war. It cannot survive the slow death of the woman holding it together. Do not follow me until you understand what I carried for you while you were busy admiring someone else." She signed it with her house name. Not the royal title. Just Selene Ardyn, the woman who existed before crowns and bonds, and the terrible education of loving a powerful man who confused possession with partnership. The escape itself was almost disappointing in its simplicity. She'd spent weeks planning exits and contingencies and backup routes, but in the end she just walked out through the servant corridors wearing a traveling cloak with the hood pulled low. Nobody stopped her. The guards were positioned to prevent intrusion, not departure. The servants were changing shifts, and queens who've made themselves invisible for years find it remarkably easy to vanish when they finally choose to. She took a horse from the eastern stables and rode toward the mountain provinces as the capital woke behind her. Nobody noticed her absence until midday when the grain merchants arrived for their appointment and found the queen's chambers empty. By then, she was 20 miles north, following roads she'd memorized from supply route maps, heading toward the one place she knew Vaelor would never think to look, because he'd never bothered learning the geography of her interests beyond how they served his empire. The mountains where healers gathered, where women went to remember who they were before powerful men taught them to forget themselves. Mad. The news reached King Vaelor Draven while he stood in the war room reviewing territorial maps with General Cross and Lady Seraphine. A servant entered. Young man, barely 20, face white with the terror of delivering information nobody wants to speak aloud. Your Majesty, the Queen is gone. Vaelor didn't look up from the map. Gone where? The servant's voice cracked. Gone from the palace, sire. Her chambers are empty. Her crown and seal are on the bed. There's a letter. The room temperature dropped 10 degrees. Vaelor raised his eyes slowly, fixed the servant with the look that made enemy commanders surrender without fighting. What do you mean, gone? She left before dawn, the servant managed. Nobody saw her depart. The stable master reports a horse missing. The eastern gate guard remembers a hooded rider but didn't recognize her face. Seraphine spoke quietly. She wouldn't just leave. Perhaps she's visiting the southern grain districts. She often travels without full escort when inspecting supply lines. Vaelor moved toward the door with the lethal precision of a predator scenting blood. His footsteps echoed through corridors that suddenly felt too large, too empty. Architectural spaces designed to amplify power, now amplifying absence instead. The royal chambers stood exactly as the servant described. Crown on the bed, seal beside it, and between them, a single piece of parchment covered in Selene's careful handwriting. He read it once, then again, then a third time while something cold and unfamiliar crawled up his spine. General Cross appeared in the doorway. Sire, we can track her. The eastern roads lead to only 3 provinces. With riders, we could overtake her before nightfall. Vaelor stared at the letter and for the first time in his rule, experienced something he'd never felt on any battlefield. Helplessness. Not the temporary helplessness of tactical disadvantage. The profound existential helplessness of a man who'd been winning a game he didn't realize he was losing until the board was empty and his opponent was gone. Do not follow me until you understand what I carried. He looked around the chamber, seeing it for the first time through different eyes. The desk covered in administrative documents she reviewed every night while he attended military briefings. The cabinet filled with ledgers tracking every resource flow in the empire. The correspondence from merchant houses and medical suppliers and border officials, all addressed to the Queen because she was the one who actually maintained the relationships that kept the kingdom functional. His gaze fell on a stack of papers near her writing desk. He picked up the top document and felt his stomach drop. Winter grain distribution protocols, written in Selene's hand. Contingency plans for 17 different supply chain failures. Backup merchant contacts. Alternative transport routes. Emergency food stores he didn't know existed. All problems she'd solved before they became crises. All work she'd done while he was focused elsewhere. He opened another document. Medical supply agreements she'd personally negotiated with healers across 8 provinces. Then another. Trade treaties she'd maintained through careful diplomacy while he was conquering new territories and creating enemies that required those same trade routes to survive. The next 3 hours disappeared into a fog of discovery and horror. Vaelor read every ledger in Selene's study, every annotation, every carefully documented contingency plan she'd prepared while he spent months intoxicated by territorial expansion and Seraphine's brilliant strategic mind. The empire he thought he ruled through strength and military dominance was actually sustained by his queen's invisible labor. She'd been holding the foundation together while he built monuments to his own glory on top of it, and he'd never noticed, never thanked her, never even acknowledged that the work existed because it happened quietly and efficiently, and queens who do essential work without demanding recognition become furniture in the minds of kings too busy conquering to see what they're destroying. General Cross returned at sunset. Sire, the scouts report she's heading toward the northern provinces. Norvac region. The mountain territories where healers practice. Vaelor stood at the window watching darkness consume the capital. Send word to the northern garrisons. I want her found, but not approached. No one interferes with her travel. She's to have complete freedom of movement. Cross frowned. But, Your Majesty, if she's truly leaving... She's not leaving, Vaelor interrupted, his voice hollow. She's already gone. Has been for months, probably. I just didn't notice her absence until she stopped pretending to be present. The general shifted uncomfortably. What are your orders regarding the council meeting tomorrow? The grain crisis still requires... Vaelor turned from the window. His face looked carved from stone. The Queen solved the grain crisis weeks ago. I was too busy seeking validation from someone else to acknowledge it. He gestured toward the documents covering Selene's desk. Implement every protocol she outlined. Contact every merchant on her lists. Follow her instructions exactly. And Lady Seraphine? Cross asked carefully. Dismissed from court, Vaelor said flatly. Effective immediately. Arrange escort back to Kareth. Generous severance. Full honors. But she's no longer welcome in this palace. Cross looked genuinely shocked. Sire, she's been instrumental in our military successes. She's been a mirror, Vaelor cut him off. Reflecting the version of myself I wanted to see. The conquering king, the strategic genius, the ruler too important for administrative details. And I was so drunk on that reflection I stopped seeing the woman actually holding the empire together. He moved to Selene's desk and touched the ledgers with something approaching reverence. Do you know what my queen did last month while I was planning the Eastern campaign? No, sire. She prevented a cholera outbreak in the southern provinces by rerouting medical supplies through back channels after the main road collapsed. Saved approximately 8,000 lives. Vaelor's voice cracked slightly. She did that while I was winning a battle that conquered 300 miles of territory we didn't need and can't actually hold without the supply infrastructure she maintains. The general said nothing. Vaelor picked up the letter and read it again. She's right. I loved her silence because it was convenient. I mistook her endurance for acceptance. I thought devotion was permanent because I'm a king, and kings are taught that loyalty is tribute people pay to power. He folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his jacket. But power doesn't guarantee love, and conquest doesn't build partnership. And I've been so focused on expanding the empire's borders, I never noticed the kingdom inside my own palace was collapsing. What will you do? Cross asked quietly. Vaelor looked at him with eyes that held a new kind of pain, something beyond physical wounds. I'm going to learn what my queen carried while I was too busy being worshipped to see her, and then I'm going to pray she gives me the chance to become worthy of her return. The northern provinces greeted Queen Selene with indifference, which felt like mercy after years of suffocating attention. She reached Norvac after 3 days of hard riding. The mountain territory spread before her in layers of pine and stone, air so cold it hurt to breathe, sky so clear the stars looked close enough to touch. She'd visited once before, years ago, when a plague threatened the region, and she'd personally delivered medical supplies because the royal couriers refused to enter contaminated zones. The healers remembered her. An older woman named Marin met her at the settlement's edge, silver hair braided with herb stems, face weathered by decades of mountain winters and human suffering. She looked at Selene's hooded face and smiled with the quiet recognition of someone who'd seen this story before. No crown today, she observed. Selene dismounted. Her legs shook from exhaustion and cold, and the sudden absence of purpose that happens when you stop running and realize you have nowhere specific to go. No crown, no title, just a woman who needs somewhere to disappear for a while. Marin took the horse's reins. We have space. Work too, if you want it. Healing hands don't care about bloodlines. The settlement was exactly what Selene needed. 20 structures built from mountain stone and timber. Healers from various provinces, mostly women, some running from abusive bonds, others searching for knowledge beyond what cities offered, all of them comfortable with silence and hard work, and the kind of acceptance that doesn't require explanation. They gave her a small room with a narrow bed and a window overlooking the cliffs. Marin showed her the herb gardens, the medicine workshops, the patient quarters where they treated everyone from mountain farmers to traveling merchants. Selene threw herself into the work with desperate intensity. She learned to identify medicinal plants by smell and texture. She ground herbs into powders and mixed poultices and helped deliver babies in the middle of freezing nights, when every breath was visible and mothers screamed in languages she didn't speak but understood perfectly because pain has no dialect. Her hands, soft from years of pushing pens and signing documents, developed calluses. Her body, maintained through royal training and careful nutrition, learned to tolerate exhaustion that went deeper than muscle. Her mind, trained for strategy and negotiation and political maneuvering, slowly untangled itself from the constant calculation of how to maintain an empire while remaining invisible. The other healers didn't ask questions, didn't pry into her history, didn't treat her with the suffocating deference she'd experienced for 6 years. They just worked beside her and shared meals and taught her songs in mountain dialects and let her cry when she needed to and left her alone when silence felt safer than conversation. For the first time since becoming queen, Selene remembered what it felt like to exist without constantly monitoring how her existence affected a powerful man's comfort. She was grinding willow bark 2 weeks after her arrival when Marin sat beside her at the work table. "You're crying into the medicine," the older woman said gently. Selene touched her face and found it wet. She hadn't noticed. "I'm sorry. I'll remake it." Marin waved this away. "The tears won't hurt the remedy. Might make it stronger. Grief is medicinal in the right doses." Selene kept grinding. The repetitive motion helped, kept her hands busy and her mind focused on something concrete instead of the howling void where her marriage used to be. "You want to talk about it?" Marin asked. "Not particularly." "That's fine. Most women who come here need silence first, words later, sometimes years later." She picked up a bundle of dried sage and began stripping leaves. "But I'll tell you something anyway because you look like you need to hear it." Selene waited. "Whatever happened before you arrived," Marin said slowly, "whatever broke in you that made leaving feel safer than staying, that breaking probably saved your life. Not your physical life, maybe, but the part of you that remembers how to be human instead of useful." The words hit harder than they should have. "I was supposed to endure," Selene whispered. "Queens don't abandon their bonds. The sacred union between alphas is permanent." Marin snorted. "Sacred for whom?" "The powerful men who benefit from women staying silent when disrespected. The empires built on the invisible labor of queens who hold everything together while kings chase glory." She leaned closer. "Let me tell you something about sacred bonds, girl. They're only sacred when both people treat them that way." Selene's hand stilled on the grinding stone. "You think you failed by leaving," Marin continued, "but you didn't fail. You survived. There's a difference. Failure would have been disappearing while staying, becoming so small and quiet and useful that nobody noticed you were dying inside while maintaining their comfort outside." "I don't know who I am without the crown," Selene admitted. The confession felt dangerous, vulnerable, like exposing a wound to mountain air and hoping it wouldn't freeze. Marin smiled. "Then you're in the right place, because that's what we do here. We help women remember who they were before powerful people taught them to forget." Bonset. King Vaelor Draven spent the first month after Selene's departure trying to hold the empire together with strategies that had always worked before. Authority, command, ruthless efficiency. It wasn't enough. The southern supply chains failed first. Merchants who'd worked exclusively with the queen refused to honor agreements with the king's representatives. Not out of disloyalty, but because Selene had spent years building personal relationships through the kind of careful, attentive diplomacy that couldn't be replicated through royal decree. She'd remembered their children's names, their harvest struggles, their religious festivals. She'd sent personal correspondence during times of hardship and attended their family celebrations and made them feel seen in a kingdom that usually treated merchants like interchangeable resources. Vaelor learned this after his third supply negotiation collapsed. The merchant looked at him across the table with barely concealed contempt. "With all respect, Your Majesty, your queen knew my daughter's name. She sent healers when my wife fell ill. She adjusted payment schedules during the drought without being asked. You're offering me contracts and threats." She offered partnership. The medical networks disintegrated next. Healers across 8 provinces simply stopped responding to royal summons. The head of the medical council finally explained why during a tense meeting where Vaelor's famous intimidation tactics accomplished exactly nothing. "Queen Selene personally funded our research," the healer said bluntly. "She visited our facilities. She listened to our needs and advocated for resources you barely knew existed. We worked with her because she respected our profession. You're just a king demanding service without offering relationship. And we have options," another healer added. The queen left instructions. Alternative funding sources, protected supply routes. She prepared for the possibility that the empire might stop supporting us if she wasn't here to maintain the connection. Vaelor felt like he was drowning. Every day revealed another system Selene had built and maintained while he was busy conquering territories and pursuing expansion and believing that power alone sustained civilization. Noble houses that had seemed unified suddenly fractured into competitive factions because Selene had been the diplomatic bridge holding fragile alliances together. Trade agreements that had appeared automatic turned out to be the result of her personal negotiations and careful attention to cultural protocols Vaelor had considered beneath his notice. Infrastructure projects that ran smoothly ground to a halt when administrators realized the Queen was the one who'd been coordinating between departments and preventing bureaucratic paralysis. The empire was collapsing, not from external attack, from internal absence. The foundation had vanished, and the palace built on top of it was cracking in every direction. General Cross found the king in Selene's study 6 weeks after her departure. Vaelor sat surrounded by ledgers and documents and correspondence, his face haggard from sleepless nights spent trying to learn in weeks what his queen had mastered over years. "The eastern provinces are threatening rebellion," Cross reported. "Food shortages. They're demanding the queen's return as a condition for continued loyalty." Vaelor laughed bitterly. "Join the list. The southern merchants won't negotiate. The medical networks won't cooperate. Half the noble houses are demanding I abdicate in favor of a ruler who actually understands governance instead of just conquest." "What do you need?" Cross asked. "My wife," Vaelor said simply. "I need Selene. She won't come back for political necessity," Cross said gently. "You know that." Vaelor looked up. His eyes were hollow. "I know. She warned me in the letter. Do not follow until you understand what I carried." He gestured at the chaos surrounding him. "I'm starting to understand, and the shame is worse than any battlefield wound I've ever endured." "Then go to her." "Not yet." Vaelor stood and moved to the window overlooking the capital. "She doesn't need another powerful man showing up to demand things from her. She needs to see that I've changed, that I've learned, that I'm capable of becoming worthy of her return instead of just entitled to it." "How do you do that from here?" Cross asked. "By fixing what I broke," Vaelor answered. "By learning to rule the way she ruled, with attention to the invisible, with respect for the people who keep empires functional, with humility about my own limitations." He turned from the window. "Summon the council, full session, every department head. I want comprehensive reports on every system the Queen maintained, every relationship she built, every protocol she established, and then we're going to learn how to do her work with a fraction of her grace until I understand enough to grovel properly." Cross almost smiled. "That's growth, sire." "That's desperation," Vaelor corrected. "But maybe they're the same thing when a man finally realizes he's been confusing power with partnership and dominance with devotion." Winter came early to the mountain provinces. Selene stood on the cliff edge, watching snow fall across valleys she'd learned to navigate without maps. 4 months since she'd left the palace. 4 months of learning who she was when nobody was watching, when her value wasn't measured by how efficiently she maintained someone else's empire. She'd become a decent healer, not exceptional, but competent enough that people trusted her with their children's fevers and their mother's pains and the 1,000 small medical crises that shaped mountain life. Her hands smelled like herbs instead of perfume now. Her clothes were plain wool instead of silk. Her hair fell loose instead of pinned in complicated royal styles that required servants and hours of preparation. She looked different, felt different, like a woman instead of a function. Marin joined her on the cliff with 2 cups of tea. The older healer had become something close to a friend, which felt miraculous after years of court relationships based entirely on utility and hierarchy. "You're thinking about going back," Marin observed. Selene accepted the tea. "How can you tell?" "Because you've stopped crying into the medicine and started staring south whenever you think nobody's watching." She sipped her tea. "Also because a very determined king has been sending messages through back channels asking about your well-being without demanding your location." Selene's heart lurched. "What messages?" "Nothing demanding, nothing entitled, just requests for confirmation that you're safe and healthy." Marin smiled slightly. "And apparently he's been learning your protocols, implementing your systems. The mountain settlements have received increased medical funding and supply support, authorized by King Vaelor Draven, using accounts the Queen established." "He's trying to fix it," Selene whispered. Or trying to understand what he broke before asking you to return, Marin said. There's a difference. Powerful men who want you back because they need your labor are dangerous. Powerful men who want you back because they finally understand what they destroyed are rare. Do you think people can change? I think pain teaches lessons that pleasure never could, Marin answered. Whether someone learns those lessons is a different question, but the fact that he's trying instead of just demanding suggests growth. Selene watched snow fall in silence. Part of her wanted to return, to see if Vaelor had truly transformed or if this was just temporary adaptation to crisis. But another part of her remembered the Festival of Embers, remembered walking 3 steps behind, remembered the moment he asked Seraphine's opinion about work Selene had completed, remembered every invisible wound that had accumulated over months until leaving felt safer than staying. I'm afraid, she admitted. What if I go back and discover he only values me now because the Empire is collapsing without me? What if this is just practical necessity instead of actual change? Then you'll know, Marin said simply, and you can leave again. You did it once. You can do it twice. The power isn't in the throne, girl. It's in knowing you can walk away whenever they stop earning your presence. Selene turned that idea over in her mind like a new herb, examining it from different angles. For 6 years, she'd believed her power came from endurance, from staying, from proving her loyalty through unwavering presence regardless of how she was treated. But maybe real power was the opposite. Maybe real power was knowing you could leave, and choosing to stay only when the relationship deserved it. The snow fell heavier as evening approached. Selene finished her tea and made her decision, not to return, not yet, but to stop running from the possibility. If Vaelor wanted her back, he would have to come find her himself. Not with armies, not with demands, but as a man willing to stand before the woman he'd destroyed and demonstrate with actions instead of words that he'd learned what she carried while he was too busy being worshipped to notice her breaking. And if he never came, that was answer enough. 3 months later, a lone rider approached the healing settlement. No royal banners, no guards, no crown. Just a man on horseback moving through snow that reached his horse's chest. Selene was grinding feverfew when Marin appeared in the doorway of the medicine workshop. You have a visitor, the older woman said quietly. Selene's hand stilled on the mortar. Who? Someone who looks like he rode through a blizzard without stopping. Marin's expression was carefully neutral. Someone who's been waiting at the settlement's edge for 3 hours without demanding entry, waiting for you to decide whether you'll see him. Selene stood slowly, her heart hammered against her ribs hard enough to hurt. She walked to the window and looked down at the settlement's entrance. King Vaelor Draven stood beside his horse in falling snow. No royal cloak, just travel-stained leather and wool. His face was thinner than she remembered, marked by exhaustion and something that looked like humility, but she couldn't be certain because she'd never seen that expression on him before. He wasn't looking at the building where she stood. He was just waiting, patient as winter. A king who'd crossed the northern frontier alone to find his queen, without any guarantee she would speak to him. Marin appeared beside her. What do you want to do? Selene watched the man who'd been her husband stand in snow that kept falling like the universe was trying to bury all their mistakes under clean white silence. She thought about the last 6 years, the slow disappearing, the Festival of Embers, the council meeting where he'd asked Seraphine's opinion about Selene's own work, every invisible wound that had driven her to this mountain. But she also thought about the messages Marin had mentioned, the protocols he'd implemented, the fact that he'd come alone instead of sending envoys, the 3 hours he'd waited without demanding anything. Maybe growth was real. Maybe powerful men could learn. Maybe empires could be rebuilt on better foundations if both people were willing to admit what the first version destroyed. I'll see him, Selene said quietly. But not in the settlement. Tell him to meet me on the eastern cliff at sunset. Alone. If he brings guards or makes demands, I'm done. Marin nodded and disappeared. Selene spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. Not physically. The mountain had taught her that appearances were theater and power was substance. But emotionally. Mentally. Bracing herself for the confrontation she'd been avoiding since the moment she left the palace. Because this conversation would determine everything. Whether Vaelor had truly changed or just adapted to crisis. Whether their bond could be rebuilt or was permanently shattered. Whether queens who disappear can ever return without losing the freedom they found in absence. The sun was setting when she walked to the eastern cliff. Vaelor stood near the edge, looking out over valleys painted gold and crimson by dying light. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and his expression nearly broke her resolve. Not the arrogant king, not the conquering alpha, just a man who'd finally learned what he'd lost and couldn't pretend he deserved it back. "Selene," he said quietly. She stopped 10 feet away. "Why are you here?" The question hung between them like a blade. Vaelor looked at her for a long moment, then answered with the only currency she would accept. "Truth. I came to tell you that I understand now. What you carried, what I ignored, what I destroyed while believing my power entitled me to your devotion without earning it." His voice was rough from cold and exhaustion, and something deeper that might have been actual remorse. "I read every ledger in your study, learned every system you maintained, watched the empire nearly collapse because I'd spent years taking your labor for granted while chasing conquest and validation from someone who reflected what I wanted to be instead of seeing who I actually was." The sun dropped lower, painting them both in shades of ending. "And I learned something terrifying," Vaelor continued. "I learned that I built a kingdom where you survived beside me instead of lived beside me, where your silence made my life easier and your endurance let me avoid accountability, and your invisible work sustained an empire I claimed to rule through strength alone." He took a step closer but stopped when she tensed. "I'm not here to demand your return," he said. "I'm here to tell you that I'm ashamed, and that I've spent 3 months learning to govern the way you governed, with attention to the invisible, with respect for the people I took for granted, with humility about my own catastrophic failures as both king and husband." "What about Seraphine?" Selene heard herself ask. "Dismissed from court the day you left," Vaelor answered. "Not because she seduced me, but because she represented the version of myself that consumed admiration while neglecting love. I don't blame her. I blame myself for being so drunk on conquest that I stopped seeing the woman actually holding everything together. The admission should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like grief, for the years wasted, the wounds inflicted, the partnership that could have been extraordinary if he'd learned these lessons before she had to break herself to teach them. "You hurt me," she said simply. "I know. You humiliated me in front of the entire empire. I know. You made me disappear while standing directly beside you." "I know," Vaelor's voice cracked, "and I will carry that shame for the rest of my life. But I'm here to ask if there's any possibility you might give me the chance to rebuild what I destroyed. Not tomorrow, not easily, but eventually." Selene looked at the man who'd been her husband and saw something she'd never seen before. Vulnerability without performance. Accountability without deflection. The kind of raw honesty that only comes when power fails to protect someone from the consequences of their choices. "I don't know if I can trust you again," she said. "I wouldn't trust me either," Vaelor admitted. "But I'm asking anyway, because losing you taught me what I should have known from the beginning. That power without awareness becomes destruction. That dominance without respect becomes cruelty. That I was so focused on being worshipped, I forgot how to be worthy." The sun touched the horizon, and Selene stood at the edge of the cliff facing the question that would define the rest of her life. Could empires be rebuilt on better foundations? Could powerful men actually transform? Could queens who'd learned to walk away ever safely return? She looked at Vaelor and saw genuine change warring with 6 years of accumulated damage. "Come back tomorrow," she said finally. "Same time, same place. I'm not ready to answer yet." Vaelor nodded slowly. His face showed relief and disappointment fighting for dominance. "I'll wait however long you need, and if I decide the answer is no, then I'll learn to live with that," he said quietly. "Because your well-being matters more than my redemption, even if it destroys me." He turned and walked back toward the settlement. Selene watched him disappear into gathering darkness, and for the first time since leaving the palace, she felt the terrible, dangerous stirring of something that might eventually become forgiveness, if he earned it. If she decided the risk was worth the possibility, if they could build something new from the ruins of what his neglect had destroyed. But that was tomorrow's question. Tonight, she stood alone on the mountain and let herself feel everything. The grief, the rage, The impossible hope that maybe broken things could be remade into something stronger if both people were willing to acknowledge what the first version cost. The stars emerged above her, and Queen Selene Ardyn, no longer quite queen, not quite healer, something in between, made herself a promise. She would not return to the palace until Vaelor proved through sustained action, not just crisis-driven transformation, that he'd learned what she carried, that he understood partnership required seeing people instead of using them, that crowns don't entitle rulers to devotion they haven't earned, and that empires built on invisible labor collapse the moment the invisible people stop pretending their pain doesn't exist. The mountain wind howled through the valleys, and somewhere in the capital 500 miles south, an empire held its breath, waiting to discover if its king had learned his lessons before the kingdom turned completely to ash. Vaelor returned to the cliff the next evening as promised, and the evening after that, and every evening for 2 weeks. He didn't speak unless Selene initiated conversation, didn't make demands, didn't try to negotiate or manipulate or deploy the persuasive strategies that had worked on generals and nobles in enemy kingdoms. He just appeared at sunset and stood on the frozen ground, waiting for her to decide whether his presence deserved acknowledgement. The restraint itself was unusual. Kings don't wait. Alphas don't submit to uncertainty. Powerful men don't tolerate situations where they lack control over outcomes. But Vaelor stood in the snow night after night, demonstrating through action what words couldn't prove, that he was capable of existing in discomfort without trying to dominate his way out of it. Selene watched from a distance for the first 3 days, testing whether his patience was genuine or performance, whether he would eventually crack and revert to the entitled, demanding version of himself that had driven her away. On the 4th evening, she approached the cliff. Vaelor turned when he heard her footsteps, but didn't smile or reach for her or make any gesture that assumed forgiveness he hadn't earned. "You came back," he said quietly. "I live here," Selene answered. "This is my cliff." The correction was deliberate, a reminder that she owned this space and he was the visitor operating on her terms in her territory. The reversal of every dynamic that had defined their marriage. Vaelor absorbed the rebuke without deflecting. "You're right. I'm the intruder. Thank you for tolerating my presence." They stood in silence while the sun bled across the horizon. The wind cut through their clothes with the kind of cold that makes breathing painful and exposed skin numb within minutes. Vaelor was shaking slightly from it. He'd been standing out here for hours before she arrived. "You could wait inside the settlement," Selene observed. "I could. But then I wouldn't be demonstrating that I'm willing to endure discomfort for you instead of expecting you to manage my comfort the way you did for 6 years. The self-awareness in that statement nearly undid her, because it proved he'd actually learned something, that his transformation wasn't just crisis adaptation, but genuine comprehension of how their dynamic had been fundamentally broken from the beginning. "Tell me about the Empire," she said. "How bad did it get after I left?" Vaelor exhaled slowly. His breath was visible in the freezing air, bad enough that I understood for the first time what you'd been preventing while I was busy taking credit for stability I didn't create. The southern provinces nearly starved because I didn't know the merchant codes you'd established. Medical networks collapsed because healers only cooperated with you. Noble houses fractured because you were the diplomatic bridge holding fragile alliances together. And now I've implemented every protocol you left behind. Hired administrators to manage the systems you created, personally visited the provinces you maintained relationships with. He paused, and discovered that governance is infinitely harder than conquest because conquest is dramatic and governance is invisible, and I spent my entire rule focused on the dramatic while you handled the invisible. "Why?" Selene asked. "Why did it take losing me to see what I was doing?" Vaelor was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was raw with something that sounded like genuine shame. "Because I'm an alpha king who was raised to believe that power is dominance and leadership is command and value is measured by how many territories you control. Nobody taught me that the foundation matters more than the monument, that the people doing invisible work are more essential than the rulers claiming credit, that partnership requires actually seeing your partner instead of just benefiting from their labor." He turned to face her fully. The setting sun painted half his face in gold and half in shadow. "I took you for granted because taking you for granted was comfortable. Your efficiency made my life easier. Your silence meant I never had to confront my own failures. Your endurance let me believe I was a good husband because you never complained loudly enough for me to hear." Selene felt tears freezing on her cheeks. "And Seraphine? Seraphine was a mirror showing me the version of myself I wanted to be," Vaelor said bluntly. "Brilliant. Strategic. Focused on conquest and expansion and the intoxicating validation of someone who made me feel intellectually stimulated. I was attracted to that reflection because it required nothing from me except being the king I already was. Whereas I required you to be human," Selene said quietly. "Yes." Vaelor's voice cracked. "You required me to pay attention, to notice details, to value invisible work, to be a partner instead of just a powerful man with a decorative queen. And that was harder than warfare, so I avoided it by focusing on someone who demanded nothing except my existing strengths." The honesty was brutal and complete, and exactly what Selene needed to hear. Not excuses, not minimization, not the defensive deflection that powerful men deploy when confronted with their failures. Just raw acknowledgement of what he'd done and why he'd done it, and the catastrophic cost of choosing comfort over consciousness. The sun disappeared behind the mountains. Darkness rushed across the valley like water filling empty space. "Come back tomorrow," Selene said. "We'll talk more." Vaelor nodded. "Same time, same place," she confirmed. "And Vaelor, don't bring me gifts or grand gestures or anything designed to accelerate forgiveness. Just bring yourself and the willingness to keep answering hard questions." "I understand." He left without looking back. Selene watched him navigate the darkening path toward the settlement and felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness yet, but the possibility of it. The recognition that genuine transformation was happening, and maybe broken things could be rebuilt if both people were willing to do the brutal work of examining what the first version destroyed. She returned to her small room and lay awake staring at ceiling beams while her mind replayed 6 years of marriage against 2 weeks of Vaelor, standing in the snow demonstrating through action what his words in the palace had never proven. That he was capable of change. That power could learn humility. That kings could become human if the consequences were severe enough to shatter their illusions. Marin found her in the medicine workshop the next morning. "You're thinking about going back," the older woman said. It wasn't a question. Selene ground herbs with more force than necessary. "I don't know what I'm thinking." "Yes, you do." Marin sat across from her. "You're thinking that he's changed, that the growth is real, that maybe the empire could be different if you returned. And you think I'm a fool." "I think you're scared," Marin corrected, "which is reasonable. Powerful men who transform under crisis sometimes revert to old patterns once the crisis passes. The question is whether you believe his change is permanent or temporary." Selene's hand stilled. "How do I know?" "Time," Marin said simply. "Sustained behavior, consistency across contexts. Does he only act differently when you're watching, or has the transformation integrated into who he is? Can he maintain humility when he's not actively afraid of losing you?" "Those are impossible questions to answer from a mountain." "Exactly," Marin smiled. "Which means eventually you'll have to return to the palace and see if he's the same man in his throne room as he is on your cliff. And that terrifies you because if he reverts, you'll know the whole thing was performance." Selene met the older woman's eyes. "What would you do?" Marin considered this. "I'd make him wait longer. Not to punish him, but to test whether his patience has limits. Powerful men who've genuinely changed can endure uncertainty without trying to control it. Men performing change eventually demand resolution because discomfort becomes unbearable." "How long?" "Until you're certain," Marin answered. "Or until you realize certainty is impossible and you have to make a choice anyway." Vaelor continued his evening vigils for another month. The settlement residents began treating his presence as normal. The strange king who appeared at sunset and stood on the eastern cliff waiting for the disappeared queen who might never forgive him. Some pitied him, others respected the discipline required to endure rejection without resorting to authority. A few thought he was performing penance for crimes they could only imagine. None of them knew the full story. But mountain people understood that some wounds required more than apologies to heal. Selene gradually increased her engagement. Short conversations became longer ones. They talked about the Empire's recovery efforts, the protocols he'd implemented, the relationships he was building with people she'd maintained connections with for years. She tested him constantly. asked questions designed to reveal whether his transformation was superficial or fundamental, pushed on topics she knew would trigger his old defensive patterns, and slowly she began to believe the change was real. Not because he said the right things. Words are cheap and powerful men learn to weaponize language. But because his behavior remained consistent even when she gave him opportunities to revert. When she criticized his governance decisions, he listened instead of defended. When she pointed out lingering blind spots, he acknowledged them instead of deflected. When she went 3 days without visiting the cliff, he waited without sending messengers or making demands. The restraint was what convinced her more than anything, because control had always been Vaelor's fundamental addiction. The need to dominate outcomes and manage perceptions and ensure situations resolved according to his preferences. But here on this frozen cliff, he was surrendering control completely, letting her set the pace, accepting uncertainty without trying to force resolution. That required a kind of strength he'd never demonstrated during their marriage. Not the strength of conquest, the strength of sitting in discomfort without demanding relief. One evening, 6 weeks after his arrival, Selene asked the question that had been building since he first appeared. "Why did you really come here?" Vaelor had been staring at the valley below. He turned to face her with an expression that held too many emotions to name. "Because losing you taught me that I'd spent my entire life confusing power with worth. I believed my value came from territories conquered and enemies defeated, and the fear I inspired in other rulers. But none of that mattered when you left. The empire nearly collapsed. My achievements felt hollow, and I realized I'd built an entire identity on dominance while neglecting the only thing that actually sustained me. Which was you," he said simply. "Not your labor or your efficiency or the invisible work you did. You. The woman who saw me before I became king, who challenged me during council meetings when I was being an arrogant fool, who loved me despite my catastrophic flaws, and then had the courage to leave when loving me started destroying you." His voice dropped to something barely audible over the wind. "I came here because I needed you to know that I finally understand, that you weren't the foundation supporting my monument. You were the partner I ignored while building monuments to myself. And I'm asking for the chance to rebuild our partnership on terms that don't require you to disappear while standing beside me." Selene felt something break open inside her chest. Not the sharp pain of old wounds reopening, the slow thaw of frozen places that had been numb for so long she'd forgotten they existed. "I'm afraid," she admitted, "that I'll return and discover this version of you only exists when you're desperate to win me back. That once I'm home, the old patterns will resurface, and I'll disappear again because powerful men always revert to dominance when they feel secure." Vaelor stepped closer but stopped when she tensed. "I'm afraid of that too, that I'll fail you again because transformation is hard, and old instincts run deep, and kings are taught from birth that authority solves problems. Then why should I risk it?" "Because I'm not asking you to risk it alone," he answered. "I'm asking you to return as an equal partner with actual authority. Not decorative power, real governance authority, shared rule written into law so the empire answers to both of us, and I can't make unilateral decisions without your consent." Selene stared at him. "You would share the throne. I would surrender half of it," Vaelor corrected, "because I've learned that the empire functions better with your governance than my conquest, that the invisible work you do is more essential than the visible glory I chased. That partnership means actually dividing power instead of just claiming to value your input while maintaining absolute control." The offer was stunning in its implications. Alphas don't share power. Kings don't voluntarily limit their authority. Dominant rulers don't create legal structures that prevent them from overriding their partners. But Vaelor was proposing exactly that, a fundamental restructuring of how the empire operated so Selene's governance authority was equal to his military command. So decisions affecting the people required both signatures. So the invisible work she'd always done would finally be visible and protected by law instead of dependent on his whims. "I need to think about this," Selene said. "Take whatever time you need. And if I decide I can't come back..." Vaelor's face showed naked pain, but his voice remained steady. "Then I'll learn to live with that. Because your well-being matters more than my redemption, and the Empire's stability matters more than my desire to have you beside me." He turned and walked back toward the settlement. Selene stood alone on the cliff, watching darkness consume the valley. and felt the weight of the choice settling onto her shoulders like snow accumulation. Heavy, inevitable. The kind of decision that would define the rest of her life regardless of which path she chose. Return and risk discovering his transformation was temporary, or stay and spend the rest of her life wondering if she'd abandoned something that could have been extraordinary if she'd been brave enough to rebuild it. Neither option was safe. Both required courage of different kinds. Marin found her in the herb garden the next morning. "You're leaving," the older woman observed. Selene looked up from the feverfew she'd been harvesting. "How can you tell?" "Because you're saying goodbye to the plants." Marin smiled gently. "Also because you've been standing at crossroads for 2 months, and crossroads always resolve eventually. You can't live suspended between choices forever. I don't know if I'm making the right decision." "Nobody ever does," Marin said. "That's what makes it a decision instead of a calculation. You're choosing based on incomplete information and the possibility of failure and the hope that what you're building will be worth the risk." She sat on the garden wall beside where Selene was kneeling in the dirt. "Let me tell you what I see," Marin continued. "I see a man who's endured 2 months of uncertainty without trying to control it. Who's offered to restructure an empire to prevent repeating his failures? Who comes back every evening despite having no guarantee you'll speak to him? That's not performance. That's transformation. And if he reverts once I'm back, then you leave again," Marin said simply. "You did it once. You can do it twice. The power isn't in the throne, girl. It's in knowing you can walk away whenever they stop earning your presence." Selene pulled feverfew stems with shaking hands. "What if walking away the second time destroys me?" "What if staying here destroys you slower?" Marin countered. "What if you spend the next 40 years wondering if you abandoned something extraordinary because you were too afraid of being hurt again? Some risks are worth taking even when failure is possible." The older woman stood and brushed dirt from her clothes. "You asked me weeks ago how to know if his change is permanent. The truth is, you can't know. You can only watch his behavior and trust your instincts and make a choice based on limited information. That's what courage is. Not the absence of fear, the willingness to act despite it." Selene finished harvesting and stood. Her decision had been made somewhere during the night while she lay awake examining the question from every angle. She'd known since yesterday evening on the cliff when Vaelor offered to restructure the Empire's power dynamics. Because that offer meant something. It meant he understood that words were insufficient, that transformation required structural change, that preventing old patterns from resurging meant creating legal frameworks that made dominance impossible even when his fear of losing her faded. "I'm going back," she said quietly. Marin nodded. "I know, but on my terms. With protections built into law, with authority that doesn't depend on his continued good behavior." "Smart," Marin approved. "Trust the structure more than the person. Systems are more reliable than individual virtue. And if it fails," Selene continued, "if I return and discover the transformation was temporary or incomplete, I'll leave again. And this time I won't feel guilty about it." "Good." Marin pulled her into a brief, hard embrace. Queens who know they can leave are the only ones who should stay. Ititik. Selene told Vaelor that evening on the cliff, "I'll return to the capital," she said without preamble, "but under specific conditions." Vaelor's face showed relief and terror fighting for dominance. "Name them." "First, the shared governance structure you proposed gets written into imperial law before I cross the palace threshold. Both signatures required for any decision affecting domestic policy. Equal authority, not advisory power. Actual veto authority." "Done," Vaelor said immediately. "Second, the council chamber gets restructured so my seat is level with yours. Not below, not to the side. Equal positioning that telegraphs equal authority." "Agreed." "Third, I maintain independent resources, separate accounts. My own guard, the ability to leave if I choose to without depending on your permission or cooperation." Vaelor flinched slightly at that, but nodded. "You should have had that from the beginning. I'll establish it immediately." "Fourth," Selene's voice hardened, "if you ever publicly humiliate me again the way you did at the Festival of Embers, if you ever ask someone else's opinion about work I've completed, if you ever make me walk behind you like a decorative accessory, the marriage ends, permanently, no second chances. The terms were brutal and comprehensive and exactly what she needed. Not because she wanted to punish him, because she needed structural protections against his potential backsliding. Needed guarantees that weren't dependent on his continued transformation or her vigilance or the dynamics that had failed before. Vaelor met her eyes. His face showed understanding of what she was really asking. Trust but verify. Commitment with exit routes. Partnership with protections. I agree to all of it, he said quietly. And I'll add a fifth condition that you didn't ask for, which is, if I revert to the patterns that drove you away, if I start taking you for granted again, if I fail to maintain the changes I've made, you tell me immediately. Don't let resentment accumulate. Don't disappear while staying. Call me on my failures when they're still small enough to correct. Selene studied his face. That puts responsibility on me to manage your behavior. No, Vaelor corrected. It puts responsibility on both of us to maintain partnership instead of falling into old dynamics where you endure silently and I remain oblivious. I'm not asking you to manage me. I'm asking you to hold me accountable before small failures become catastrophic ones. The distinction mattered. It meant he understood that transformation wasn't a destination, but ongoing work. That preventing regression required both people actively maintaining new patterns instead of just hoping old ones wouldn't resurface. When do we leave? Selene asked. Whenever you're ready. Tomorrow, next week, next month. I'll wait however long you need to prepare. Tomorrow, she decided. Before I lose my nerve. Vaelor's face showed naked relief. Thank you for giving me this chance, for being willing to risk trusting me again despite every reason not to. Don't thank me yet, Selene said. Thank me in 5 years if we've built something that actually works. Right now, this is just potential. Potential fails more often than it succeeds. Then I'll spend the next 5 years earning your continued presence, Vaelor answered, and proving that some broken things can be rebuilt into something stronger if both people are willing to examine what the first version cost. Get back. They left the mountain settlement at dawn. Marin and the other healers gathered to see Selene off. The older woman pulled her aside before she mounted her horse. Remember what I told you, Marin said quietly. The power isn't in the throne, it's in knowing you can leave. I won't forget, and don't let him forget it either. Men who remember their partners can walk away are the only men who deserve partnership. Selene embraced her. Thank you for giving me space to remember who I was before crowns and bonds and the terrible education of loving a powerful man. You remembered yourself, Marin corrected. I just gave you somewhere safe to do it. The ride south took 4 days. They traveled without royal escort. Just 2 people on horseback moving through winter landscape that was slowly beginning to thaw. Snow still covered the higher elevations, but the valleys showed patches of brown earth emerging like wounds, healing from the inside out. They didn't talk much during the journey. The silence wasn't hostile, just necessary. Both of them processing the magnitude of what they were attempting and the 1,000 ways it could fail. On the 3rd night, they made camp beside a frozen stream. Vaelor built the fire while Selene prepared their meal from trail rations and herbs she'd brought from the settlement. The domestic normalcy of it felt strange after 6 years of servants managing every physical need. You're good at that, Vaelor observed as she wrapped fish in leaves for roasting. Mountain living teaches practical skills, Selene answered. Turns out queens who know how to heal and cook and manage without servants are more resilient than queens who only know politics. I should have learned those skills too, Vaelor said. Should have understood that self-sufficiency matters more than authority. You can learn now. Selene handed him the wrapped fish. Put these near the coals, not directly in the fire, or they'll burn. He accepted the task with the focused attention of someone learning a new tactical maneuver. Placed the packages carefully. Monitored the heat. Adjusted positions when she indicated they needed rotating. The simple cooperation felt revolutionary, because during their marriage they'd never done anything like this. Never worked together on practical tasks. Never functioned as a team outside formal political contexts where hierarchy dictated every interaction. This was different. This was partnership at its most basic. 2 people keeping each other alive through mutual effort instead of one person serving while the other consumed service without noticing. They ate in silence while stars emerged overhead. I'm scared, Vaelor admitted suddenly. Selene looked at him across the fire. Of what? That I'll fail you again. That the old patterns will resurface when I'm tired or stressed or facing challenges that make dominance feel easier than partnership. That I've changed under crisis but can't maintain transformation under normal circumstances. The honesty was disarming. Most powerful men would rather die than admit fear. But Vaelor was sitting beside a fire in the wilderness, confessing vulnerability without trying to manage how it made him look. "I'm scared too," Selene said. "That I'll disappear again. That I'll start managing your comfort instead of maintaining my boundaries. That partnership will erode back into the dynamic where I carry everything invisible while you chase everything visible." "Then we'll be scared together," Vaelor said quietly, "and we'll build structures that protect us both from our worst instincts." The fire crackled between them, and two people who'd broken each other made promises they hoped they could keep. The capital appeared on the horizon at midday. White marble towers rising against blue sky. Crimson banners snapping in wind that carried the smell of the sea and wood smoke, and the particular combination of commerce and humanity that defined large cities. Selene's chest tightened as they approached. 6 months ago, she'd fled this place wearing a traveling cloak and carrying nothing but determination to survive. Now she was returning as something different. Not the disappeared queen, not the invisible administrator, something new that didn't have a name yet. Partner, equal. Woman who knew she could leave. The gates opened at their approach. Guards who'd been expecting them formed an honor escort, but Vaelor waved them back. "We walk through the city," he said. "No barriers between us and the people." The decision was tactically brilliant and symbolically powerful, because it meant Selene's return wasn't a private matter between king and queen. It was a public reestablishment of partnership that the entire empire would witness. The disappeared queen walking beside her king through streets that had whispered about her abandonment and the collapse that followed. People lined the route. Merchants who'd refused to negotiate with royal representatives after Selene left. Healers who'd withdrawn cooperation when she vanished. Noble families who'd watched the Festival of Embers humiliation and stayed silent. They watched now with expressions ranging from curiosity to relief to something that might have been respect. Because queens who leave powerful men and survive are rare. Queens who return on their own terms are revolutionary. Selene kept her spine straight and her face calm. Met eyes instead of dropping her gaze. Existed visibly instead of making herself small. The palace loomed ahead. And despite her fear and uncertainty and the 1,000 valid reasons to turn around and ride back to the mountains, Selene crossed the threshold beside Vaelor as winter began breaking across the empire and something new started taking shape in the ruins of what his neglect had destroyed. The council chamber had been restructured exactly as she'd demanded. Selene stood in the doorway examining the changes while Vaelor waited silently beside her. Her chair now sat level with the king's throne. Same height, same materials, same positioning that telegraphed equal authority instead of hierarchical subordination. The architectural modification had required rebuilding significant portions of the dais and probably caused massive administrative headaches. But it was done. The council members gathered for her first official session back looked uncomfortable with the new arrangement. 15 men who'd spent years addressing the king while treating the queen's input as optional were now confronted with a structure that made ignoring her legally impossible. General Cross stood when she entered. "Your Majesty, welcome home." "Thank you, General." Selene moved to her seat and sat without waiting for permission or protocol. "Are the shared governance amendments ratified?" Cross glanced at Vaelor, who nodded permission for him to answer. "Yes, Your Majesty. Both signatures now required for any domestic policy decision. Equal veto authority, the council reports to both thrones." "Good." Selene opened the ledger she'd brought from the mountain. "Then let's begin with the grain crisis resolution. I understand the protocols I left were implemented. What's the current status?" For the next 3 hours, she led the council session with surgical precision, asked questions that revealed whether administrators had actually learned her systems or just followed instructions without understanding underlying principles. Identified gaps in implementation. Corrected assumptions that demonstrated how thoroughly invisible her work had been. The council members adapted slowly to the new dynamic, some with relief because Selene's return meant stability, Others with resentment because shared power meant reduced autonomy for men accustomed to influencing the king without queen oversight. A few with genuine respect because watching her govern made visible the catastrophic gap between Vaelor's conquest focus and her infrastructure maintenance. Vaelor himself remained mostly silent during the session, not because he lacked opinions, but because he was demonstrating through behavior what his words in the mountains had promised, that he valued her governance, that he recognized her expertise, that partnership meant knowing when to speak and when to let your partner lead. The restraint was noticed. Council members who'd watched him dismiss Selene's work for years now witnessed him deferring to her judgment on domestic policy matters. The reversal was so dramatic it bordered on theatrical, except the context made it necessary rather than performative. This was a king proving through sustained action that his transformation was real. After the session ended and the council members filed out, Selene remained in her chair examining the chamber with new eyes. "It feels different," she said quietly. Vaelor stood beside her throne. "Because it is different. You're not invisible anymore." "I was never invisible. I was ignored. There's a distinction." "You're right." Vaelor sat in his own throne facing her. "I'm sorry for the years I spent benefiting from your labor while pretending it didn't exist, for taking credit for stability you created, for treating your expertise as optional when it was actually foundational." The apology was comprehensive and specific and exactly what she needed, not vague regret, precise acknowledgement of particular failures and their impact. "How's the Empire actually doing?" Selene asked. "Not the official reports. The truth." "Stabilizing," Vaelor answered, "but fragile. The systems you built are functioning again now that we're following your protocols. But 6 months of disruption created damages that will take years to fully repair. Some merchant relationships may never fully recover. Some political alliances are permanently fractured. Because of my departure. Because of my failures," Vaelor corrected. "You left because staying was destroying you. The chaos that followed was consequence of my neglect, not your absence. The Empire nearly collapsed because I built it on your invisible labor without protecting or acknowledging or even noticing what sustained it." Selene stood and moved to the window overlooking the city. Lights were appearing as evening approached. Thousands of individual lives depending on decisions made in this chamber by rulers who hopefully had learned that power without awareness becomes destruction. "I'm still angry," she admitted. "At you. At myself for tolerating mistreatment for so long. At the Empire for staying silent while I was being humiliated." "You should be angry," Vaelor said. "Anger is appropriate response to betrayal. Don't let me or anyone else convince you to forgive before you're ready." The permission to maintain anger was itself healing, because for 6 years she'd been taught that queens who held grudges were petty, and forgiveness was nobility, and moving past hurt was strength. But that teaching had trained her to swallow legitimate rage and transform justified anger into silent endurance. Vaelor's acknowledgement that her anger was valid and deserved gave her permission to feel it fully, instead of performing premature forgiveness. "I don't know if this will work," she said. "Neither do I. But I'm willing to fail trying if you are." Selene turned from the window. The city lights reflected in glass made her face look fractured, divided. A woman caught between who she'd been and who she was becoming. "Then we try," she decided. With protections in place, with exit routes maintained, with the understanding that partnership is ongoing work, not a destination. "Agreed." "And Vaelor," her voice hardened, "if you ever make me feel invisible again, if you ever prioritize someone else's validation over our partnership, if you ever humiliate me publicly the way you did before, I will leave. And next time, I won't come back." The threat hung between them like a blade. Vaelor met her eyes. "I understand. And I accept those terms because they're appropriate consequences for failures I never want to repeat." Night fell across the capital, and 2 people who destroyed each other stood in a restructured throne room, making promises about a future neither could guarantee, but both were willing to fight for, despite knowing that some wounds never fully heal, and some trust once broken can never be completely restored. The Empire held its breath, waiting to discover if crowns could learn humility, if power could coexist with partnership, if kings who'd spent lifetimes confusing dominance with devotion could actually transform into partners worthy of the women standing beside them. The answer would take years to emerge. But for now, in this moment, Queen Selene Ardyn stood in her palace beside King Vaelor Draven and chose to try rebuilding what his blindness had shattered. Not because she'd forgiven everything, not because the risk wasn't terrifying, but because some things are worth attempting even when failure is possible. An empires built on genuine partnership instead of invisible exploitation might actually survive the storms that destroy kingdoms built on dominance alone. The first 3 months of Selene's return felt like walking across ice that might crack at any moment. Not because Vaelor reverted to old patterns. He didn't. He maintained the transformation with discipline that bordered on obsessive, consulted her on every decision, deferred to her expertise on domestic policy, made their partnership visible in ways that forced the empire to acknowledge her authority. But visibility creates new vulnerabilities. Queens who operate invisibly can be ignored but remain protected by obscurity. Queens who govern visibly become targets for people threatened by power redistribution. And the Vaelor Empire had centuries of entrenched interests that depended on traditional hierarchies where kings commanded and queens decorated. Selene felt the resistance immediately. Not open rebellion, nothing so clean or confrontable, just the subtle systemic pushback that happens when institutions designed for male dominance encounter female authority that refuses to perform deference. Council members who suddenly needed clarification on protocols they'd followed for years when she gave instructions. Administrative delays that mysteriously appeared when implementing her policies. Noble houses that requested meetings with the king specifically, as if her co-signature on governance decisions was procedural formality instead of legal requirement. She documented every instance, built case files tracking patterns of resistance, prepared for the confrontation she knew was coming because power never surrenders territory without fighting back. The breaking point arrived during the spring grain negotiations. Selene had spent weeks preparing agreements with southern merchants to secure food supplies before summer planting season. Complex treaties that balanced imperial needs against merchant profit margins while protecting farming communities from exploitation. The kind of invisible diplomatic infrastructure that prevented famines before they formed. She presented the finalized agreements during council session, expecting routine ratification since Vaelor had reviewed and approved every clause. General Cross spoke first. "Your Majesty, the military command has concerns about the grain allocation percentages. We believe increasing military reserves from 12% to 18% would better serve imperial security." Selene kept her voice level. The current allocation already exceeds historical military consumption by 3%. Increasing to 18 would create civilian shortages in border provinces. Cross glanced at Vaelor. "With respect, Your Majesty, military preparedness requires flexibility. We're recommending the king exercise override authority on this specific provision." The room temperature dropped, because override authority didn't exist under the new governance structure. Both signatures required. Equal veto power. No unilateral decisions on domestic policy. But Cross was testing whether that structure would hold under pressure or collapse when military interests conflicted with civilian welfare. Selene looked at Vaelor, waited to see if he would honor the partnership or revert to old patterns where military priorities automatically trumped everything else. Vaelor met her eyes, then spoke with absolute clarity. "General Cross, the shared governance amendments eliminated override authority. The Queen's expertise on grain distribution exceeds mine. If she says 18% creates civilian risk, then we maintain 12% and improve military efficiency instead of demanding larger allocations." Relief flooded through Selene. But before she could respond, Lord Chancellor Hendrik spoke from his position at the table's far end. "Your Majesty, the Council requests clarification on the governance structure itself, specifically whether emergency provisions allow for temporary suspension of dual signature requirements during crisis situations." It was a trap disguised as procedural question, because establishing emergency exceptions would create loopholes that military and noble interests could exploit by manufacturing crises that required urgent unilateral action. Selene answered before Vaelor could. "No emergency provisions exist. Crises don't eliminate partnership. They require it more urgently." Hendrik smiled thinly. "Even theoretical crises involving immediate military threat where deliberation time could cost lives." "Even then," Selene said flatly, "decisions made in panic without consultation are how empires create catastrophes while believing they're preventing them." The Chancellor looked at Vaelor, and the king agrees with this interpretation. Every council member watched Vaelor's face. This was the real test, not whether he supported Selene when it was comfortable, but whether he would maintain partnership when powerful men were openly challenging, whether her authority was legitimate or just decorative theater he'd installed to win her back. Vaelor stood slowly. His presence filled the room the way it always did when he stopped performing restraint and let his alpha dominance show. Chancellor Hendrik, let me clarify something that apparently remains unclear despite 3 months of restructuring. Queen Selene's governance authority is not advisory. It's not conditional on my approval. It's not suspended during emergencies or military operations or any other circumstance where powerful men decide female input is inconvenient. His voice cut through the chamber like a blade. She is co-ruler of this empire with equal legal authority. Any attempt to undermine that authority is treason against the crown. Both crowns. Do I make myself absolutely clear? The silence that followed was total. Hendrik's face went carefully blank. Perfectly clear, Your Majesty. But Selene saw the calculation behind his eyes, the cold assessment of a man who'd just learned that direct confrontation wouldn't work and was already planning alternative approaches. Because institutional resistance is like water. When blocked in one direction, it finds another route. And men who've held power for decades don't surrender it just because a king makes threats. They adapt. They wait. They look for vulnerabilities in the new structure and exploit them with surgical precision. The session ended shortly after. Council members filed out with faces that revealed nothing and eyes that revealed everything. Most were calculating how to navigate the new reality. A few were actively planning how to dismantle it. Selene remained in her seat after the chamber emptied. Vaelor approached cautiously. You handled that perfectly. Did I? Selene stared at the table where 15 men had just tested whether her authority was real or performance, because it felt like putting out one fire while a dozen others ignite in places I can't see. They're testing boundaries, Vaelor said, seeing if the structure holds under pressure. It's expected. Expected doesn't make it sustainable. Selene stood and moved to the window. Every decision I make requires defending my right to make it. Every policy I implement faces challenges that your policies never encounter. I'm spending more energy fighting for legitimacy than actually governing. Vaelor joined her at the window. What do you need? Consequences, Selene answered. Visible consequences for the people undermining partnership. Hendrik's question about emergency provisions was direct challenge to the governance structure. If he faces no penalty, others will follow his example until death by 1,000 cuts destroys what we built. Vaelor was silent for a long moment. You want me to remove him from the council? I want you to demonstrate that attacking my authority has costs. Otherwise, we're just playing theater where you proclaim partnership while the Empire learns that challenging me is risk-free. The request put Vaelor in an impossible position. Hendrik was powerful, connected to noble houses that controlled significant territory. Removing him would create political backlash and potential instability, but not removing him would signal that Selene's authority could be questioned without consequences. It was exactly the kind of choice that revealed whether transformation was genuine or conditional on convenience. I'll handle it, Vaelor said finally. By tomorrow's council session, Hendrik will understand that undermining you is the same as undermining me. Selene wanted to believe him, but something cold was spreading through her chest. The familiar sensation of standing on collapsing ground while everyone around her pretended the foundation was solid. She'd felt this before. In the months leading up to her departure, when Vaelor started choosing Seraphine's validation over Selene's expertise, when the Empire slowly taught her that speaking cost more than silence, when partnership eroded into performance and she became invisible while standing in plain sight. This felt similar. Different context. Same underlying dynamic. The Empire resisting her authority while waiting for Vaelor to stop defending it. And the terrifying question was whether his defense would last. Whether he could maintain partnership not just for 3 months, but for years. Through political pressure and institutional resistance, and the constant grinding effort of protecting authority that should have been unquestionable but required eternal vigilance because the Empire was designed for male rule, and every deviation from that design provoked backlash. That night Selene couldn't sleep. She stood on their private balcony watching the capital sleep beneath stars that looked too distant to provide comfort. Vaelor found her there near midnight. "You're worrying," he observed. "I'm calculating probabilities," Selene corrected, "assessing how long you can maintain this before the cost becomes unsustainable." He moved beside her, careful not to touch without permission. What cost? Political capital. Relationship damage with powerful houses. The constant effort of defending partnership against people who benefit from hierarchy. Selene's voice was hollow. You removed Seraphine easily because she was an outsider, but Hendrik represents entrenched power. Removing him creates enemies, and eventually you'll face a choice between protecting me and protecting the Empire's stability. And you think I'll choose the Empire? I think you're a king, Selene said simply. And kings are trained from birth that imperial stability matters more than individual relationships, that personal loyalty becomes weakness when it conflicts with political necessity, that sacrifice is noble when it serves the greater good. Vaelor absorbed this. You're describing the logic that let me ignore your suffering for years. Yes, because that logic doesn't disappear just because you've grown aware of it. It's still there. Embedded in every instinct you developed during 30 years of training to prioritize empire over everything else. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, while two people stood in darkness confronting the truth that transformation has limits, and institutional power corrodes individual virtue, and even genuine change struggles against systems designed to resist it. I won't abandon you again, Vaelor said quietly. You can't promise that, Selene answered, because you don't know what choices you'll face, what pressures will accumulate, what moment will arrive where protecting me damages the Empire and you have to decide which matters more. Then we build stronger structures, Vaelor said, more legal protections, deeper institutional changes that make undermining you politically impossible instead of just expensive. Selene wanted to believe structures could save them, but she'd studied enough history to know that structures only hold when powerful people choose to honor them. And when those people decide structures are inconvenient, they find ways to dismantle them while claiming institutional necessity. The Empire was already probing for weaknesses, and she had no idea how long Vaelor's defense would last before something broke. The breaking happened faster than she expected. 10 days after the council confrontation, while Selene was inspecting southern grain storage facilities, a courier arrived with urgent summons back to the capital. Medical emergency. Vaelor injured during border skirmish with raiders from the eastern territories. She rode through the night, fear clawing at her chest despite their complicated history and uncertain future. Whatever existed between them now, she didn't want him dead or permanently damaged. The palace was chaos when she arrived at dawn. Servants rushing through corridors, guards stationed at unusual positions, an atmosphere of controlled panic that happened when leadership was compromised, and everyone was trying to maintain order while secretly terrified about succession and stability. General Cross met her at the royal chamber's entrance. Your Majesty. The king is stable but unconscious. Blade wound to the shoulder. Significant blood loss. The healers expect full recovery, but he'll be incapacitated for at least 2 weeks. Selene pushed past him into the chamber where Vaelor lay motionless beneath heavy blankets. His face was gray beneath the bandages wrapping his torso, breathing shallow but steady. Relief and terror fought for dominance in her chest. Relief that he was alive. Terror about what came next. Because incapacitated kings created power vacuums. And power vacuums revealed who actually controlled the empire beneath the ceremonial authority. What happened? She demanded. Eastern raiders attacked a border patrol, Cross explained. The king was inspecting the territory personally, took a blade during combat. We eliminated the raiders, but His Majesty was already wounded. The story felt wrong, not fabricated necessarily, but incomplete, like receiving half the information while the important parts remained hidden. I need to speak with the patrol commander who is present. He's being debriefed by military intelligence, Cross said smoothly. Standard protocol after command-level injury. I want him brought here within the hour. Cross hesitated. Your Majesty, perhaps after you've rested. Within the hour, General. Selene's voice carried the authority she'd fought 3 months to establish. And summoned the full council. Emergency session. If the king is incapacitated, governance transfers to the co-ruler per the succession amendments. Another hesitation. Of course, Your Majesty. Though some council members may argue that military emergencies require what? Selene interrupted. Require male authority because female governance is decorative. Finish that sentence, General, so we both understand what you're suggesting. Cross's face went carefully neutral. I'm suggesting nothing, Your Majesty, merely anticipating arguments others may raise. Then let them raise those arguments in council where I can address them directly instead of through intermediaries who think I don't notice when I'm being managed. She turned back to Vaelor's unconscious form and felt the ice beneath her feet cracking faster. This was the test she'd warned him about on the balcony 10 days ago. The moment where protecting her authority conflicted with institutional preference for male rule, and the Empire revealed what it actually believed about partnership versus hierarchy. And he wasn't conscious to defend the structure they'd built. The council convened 2 hours later. 14 men gathered in the chamber with expressions ranging from genuine concern to barely concealed satisfaction. Lord Chancellor Hendrik sat in his usual position looking like someone who'd been planning for exactly this contingency. Selene took her seat on the throne, alone now. The empty chair beside her telegraphed vulnerability she couldn't afford to show. Gentlemen, she began, King Vaelor is incapacitated but stable. For the governance amendments, full authority transfers to me until he recovers. All decisions proceed with my signature. Are there questions? Hendrik spoke immediately. Your Majesty, the Council recognizes your legal authority under normal circumstances. However, this situation involves military crisis requiring rapid tactical response. We recommend establishing a temporary advisory council with General Cross to— No, Selene cut him off. The governance structure contains no provisions for temporary councils or military exceptions. I rule during the king's incapacity, alone if necessary, with counsel if useful. But the authority is mine. She let that settle before continuing. Now, I want a complete report on the border incident. How did raiders penetrate secured territory? Why was the king exposed during routine patrol? Who authorized his presence in active combat zones? The council members exchanged glances that communicated entire conversations without words. Finally, General Cross spoke. Your Majesty, the tactical details are being investigated. It would be premature to speculate before— I'm not asking for speculation, Selene said coldly. I'm asking for facts. The king was injured under military protection. Someone failed catastrophically. I want to know who and why. The silence that followed felt dangerous, like standing in a room where everyone knows something you don't, and they're calculating whether revealing it serves their interests. Chancellor Hendrik leaned forward. Your Majesty, perhaps the more pressing question is how to respond to the border instability. The raiders may attempt another incursion. We need immediate military authorization to reinforce eastern defenses. That's General Cross's authority under existing protocols, Selene answered. He doesn't need my signature for tactical deployments. He does if those deployments require reallocating grain reserves from civilian to military use, Hendrik countered. Which they will. Extended border reinforcement means feeding additional troops beyond current supply allocations. And there it was. The real agenda hiding beneath concern about Vaelor's injury. They were using his incapacity to resurrect the grain allocation fight Selene had won 2 weeks ago, trying to force civilian resource redistribution to military control while she ruled alone without Vaelor present to reinforce her authority. The allocation percentages remain unchanged, Selene said flatly. Find military efficiency improvements instead of demanding civilian sacrifice. Your Majesty, Hendrik's voice hardened slightly. With all respect, military operations require flexibility. Refusing necessary resource reallocation because of civilian concerns could cost lives if raiders escalate attacks. Then improve intelligence to prevent escalation instead of demanding more grain after intelligence failures already injured the king, Selene shot back. This council won't manipulate crisis to undermine governance decisions you couldn't overturn through legitimate process. The temperature in the room plummeted, because she just accused them directly of using Vaelor's injury as political opportunity, of exploiting his incapacity to dismantle the authority structure he'd built protecting her. And based on their faces, the accusation was accurate. Lord Treasurer Morven spoke carefully. Your Majesty, I don't believe anyone is suggesting manipulation. We're simply adapting to rapidly changing circumstances that require— That require what? Selene interrupted. Require pushing the queen aside the moment the king can't defend her. Require reverting to comfortable hierarchies where men make real decisions and women provide decorative approval. She stood, letting her full authority fill the room. Let me be absolutely clear. The governance structure stands regardless of King Vaelor's capacity. My authority is not conditional on his presence. Attempts to undermine it will be treated as treason against the crown. Both crowns. She was using Vaelor's exact words from the previous confrontation with Hendrik, but without Vaelor present to reinforce them with his alpha dominance, the words felt hollow, like reading a script without the actor's presence to sell the performance. The council members heard the difference. Hendrik smiled slightly. Of course, Your Majesty. No one questions your authority. We simply want to ensure the Empire has the resources needed to protect itself during this difficult transition. Transition, Selene repeated. Interesting word choice, Chancellor. The king is injured, not dead. There's no transition, just temporary incapacity that changes nothing about governance structure. Of course, Hendrik agreed smoothly. Poor word choice on my part. But the damage was done. Because everyone in that room now understood that Hendrik and his faction viewed Vaelor's injury as opportunity to test how much power Selene actually held without her co-ruler present to defend her, and they were betting she couldn't hold it alone. The session ended with uneasy compromises that felt more like defeats. Selene maintained her position on grain allocation, but conceded increased military intelligence funding, held the governance structure intact, but agreed to daily briefings that gave the council more oversight than they'd had before. Small erosions that would accumulate into systemic failure if Vaelor remained incapacitated long enough. She returned to his chambers after the session and stood beside his unconscious form, feeling rage and fear battling for dominance. You promised, she whispered, promised this structure would protect me. That partnership was real, that I wouldn't be alone fighting for legitimacy the moment you couldn't defend it. Vaelor couldn't answer, and Selene stood in the royal chambers understanding with crystalline clarity that all their work restructuring the empire meant nothing if it depended on his constant presence to maintain. True partnership required structures that held without him, and they'd failed to build them deep enough. Vaelor remained unconscious for 6 days. 6 days of Selene ruling alone, while the council slowly tightened constraints around her authority. Nothing dramatic, nothing she could definitively call rebellion. Just bureaucratic friction that made every decision harder than it should be. Reports that arrived incomplete requiring follow-up that delayed decisions. Administrative procedures that suddenly needed additional approvals. Noble houses that requested clarification on policies that had been clear for months. Death by 1,000 cuts. The strategy was brutally effective because it gave her nothing concrete to fight. No open challenge she could crush with authority. Just systemic resistance that exhausted her while maintaining plausible deniability. She worked 18-hour days trying to maintain governance while managing the slow erosion of her power. Barely slept. Stopped eating regularly. Felt herself disappearing again into the machinery of keeping an empire functional while that empire actively resisted her leadership. Marin's words echoed in her memory. The power isn't in the throne, it's in knowing you can leave. But could she leave now? With Vaelor unconscious and the empire fracturing and her departure potentially triggering exactly the collapse they'd spent months preventing. The question tormented her during sleepless nights standing on the balcony staring at a capital that felt more like a prison than a kingdom. On the 7th day, Vaelor woke. Selene was reviewing grain reports when a servant rushed in with the news. She abandoned the documents and moved to his chambers with her heart hammering against her ribs. He was sitting up when she entered, still pale but conscious and alert and alive. Relief crashed through her so powerfully she had to grip the doorframe for support. Selene? His voice was rough from disuse. How long was I out? 6 days, she moved to his bedside. The healers say you'll recover fully, but you need rest. 6 days, he repeated. His eyes sharpened with the focus that made him dangerous on battlefields. What's happened? How is the Empire? And there was the question she'd been dreading, because answering honestly meant admitting how quickly things had deteriorated, how fragile their carefully constructed partnership actually was, how thoroughly the council had tested her authority the moment he couldn't defend it. "The truth is, the Empire is fine, and I'm not," she said flatly. "The council spent the last 6 days systematically undermining every structure we built. Not openly. Not in ways I could directly confront. Just constant bureaucratic resistance designed to exhaust me into accepting reduced authority." Vaelor's face darkened. "Who?" "Hendrik leads, but others follow," Selene answered. "They're using your injury to test whether my power is real or just existed because you protected it, and the answer appears to be the latter." She sat on the edge of his bed, exhaustion making her movements heavy. "You were right that first day on the mountain. I asked what you carried, and you told me. But I didn't fully understand until now. You didn't just maintain the Empire's infrastructure. You fought constant battles for legitimacy while I was too busy conquering to notice. And now I'm watching the same thing happen to me." Vaelor reached for her hand. His grip was weak but steady. "I'll handle the council. Make it clear that undermining you is unacceptable." "For how long?" Selene asked. "How long can you fight to protect my authority before it becomes unsustainable? Before the political cost exceeds the benefit? Before you face the choice I warned you about and decide the Empire's stability matters more than our partnership?" The question hung between them, and Vaelor had no answer because they both knew the truth. Structures built on individual virtue are only as strong as that individual's capacity to maintain them. And no one, not even the most powerful king in 5 territories, could fight forever against an empire designed to resist exactly the kind of partnership they were attempting. Someone knocked on the door. General Cross entered without waiting for permission. His face was grim. "Your Majesty, we have a situation. Eastern Territory reports indicate the border incident wasn't raiders. It was coordinated assassination attempt by a faction within our own military." The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Vaelor went absolutely still. "Explain." "The patrol commander finally broke under interrogation," Cross continued. "He was paid by parties unknown to ensure you were exposed during the border inspection. The raiders were hired mercenaries. The entire incident was staged to injure or kill you." Selene felt ice spreading through her chest. Because this changed everything. This wasn't political resistance or bureaucratic pushback or institutional friction. This was someone actively trying to remove Vaelor from power. And the most terrifying question was whether they'd been trying to kill him or just incapacitate him long enough to dismantle the governance structure protecting Selene. "Who paid the commander?" Vaelor demanded. "He won't say. Claims he'll be dead within a day if he reveals his employers." "Then protect him," Vaelor snapped. "Maximum security. I want answers." Cross hesitated. "Your Majesty, there's more. We discovered correspondence in Chancellor Hendrik's private chambers, communications with Eastern mercenary groups, payments that align with the timeline of the border incident." Selene's world tilted. Hendrik, the man who'd questioned emergency provisions, who'd tested her authority during council sessions, who'd led the systematic resistance during Vaelor's incapacity. He'd tried to have Vaelor killed, not just undermining partnership through political means, actively attempting assassination to create the power vacuum needed to completely dismantle the shared governance structure. "Where is he now?" Vaelor's voice was deadly calm. "Under arrest," Cross answered. "Awaiting trial for treason." "No trial," Vaelor said flatly. "Execution. Tomorrow. Public. I want the entire Empire to witness what happens to people who attack this crown." Selene's hand tightened on his. "Both crowns," she corrected quietly. Vaelor looked at her. His eyes held the lethal focus that had conquered 5 territories before age 30. "Both crowns," he agreed. "The Empire needs to understand that attacking either of us is treason against the entire structure." But even as he said it, Selene understood the deeper truth that was slowly crystallizing. Hendrik hadn't acted alone. Assassination attempts required support, resources, networks of complicit people who believed removing the king would benefit their interests, which meant the conspiracy was larger than one ambitious chancellor. It meant significant portions of the Empire's power structure wanted the partnership destroyed badly enough to kill for it. And executing Hendrik would eliminate one threat while leaving the larger network intact, and even more dangerous because they'd learned that half measures failed, and next time they'd need to be more thorough. We need to investigate fully before executing anyone, Selene said. Find everyone involved. Map the entire conspiracy. That could take months, Cross objected. Then it takes months, Selene answered, because executing Hendrik without understanding the full scope just drives the conspiracy underground where we can't see it forming the next attempt. Vaelor looked between them. She's right. Maximum security on Hendrik. Begin deep investigation. I want every connection mapped before we move. Cross nodded and left. Silence filled the chamber. Selene stood and moved to the window. Dawn was breaking across the Capitol, painting everything in shades of blood and gold. They tried to kill you, she said quietly, because they knew killing you was the only way to destroy what we built. Yes. Which means partnership threatens them more than we realized, threatens them enough to risk treason and execution. Vaelor pushed himself upright despite the healer's orders to rest. The governance structure we created isn't just political inconvenience to them. It's existential threat to centuries of male dominance. Of course, they're willing to kill to preserve it. Selene turned from his window. And if they succeed next time, if they kill you and I'm left ruling alone, how long before they manufacture crisis that requires my removal? How long before female authority becomes impossible to maintain without you there to defend it with your alpha dominance? The question she'd been avoiding since his injury finally spoken aloud. Vaelor met her eyes. Then we build deeper protections, more institutional changes, legal frameworks that make partnership mandatory regardless of who holds the throne. That takes years, Selene said. Years of fighting resistance every single day while wondering if the next border incident or hunting accident or food poisoning is another assassination attempt. Yes, Vaelor agreed. It takes years. And constant vigilance and the willingness to purge anyone who threatens the structure regardless of their power or connections. His voice hardened. But the alternative is accepting that empires can't change, that partnership is impossible in kingdoms designed for dominance, that women who demand equality will always be pushed aside by men who benefit from hierarchy. He stood carefully, moving toward her despite obvious pain from his injury. I'm not accepting that, he continued. I'm not letting them destroy what we built, even if it means spending the rest of my rule fighting my own empire to protect your authority. Selene looked at the man who'd broken her and then transformed himself and now stood offering to wage war against his own kingdom to maintain their partnership, and felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness. She'd already forgiven what could be forgiven. This was different. This was the recognition that maybe transformation was real after all, that maybe some people could actually change fundamentally instead of just adapting temporarily to crisis, that maybe empires could be rebuilt if the people leading them were willing to fight for partnership even when fighting cost everything. The sun cleared the horizon, and two people stood in royal chambers that had nearly become a tomb, facing the truth that building something new always provokes violent resistance from people invested in old structures. The conspiracy would be deep, the fight would be brutal, the cost would be catastrophic. But for the first time since returning to the palace, Selene felt something that resembled hope. Not naive hope that believed problems would solve themselves. Realistic hope that new partnership required constant defense, but was worth defending anyway. Because empires that killed their own kings to prevent female governance were empires that desperately needed exactly the kind of transformation Vaelor and Selene were attempting. And maybe that transformation was possible. If they were willing to burn down every institution that resisted it, if they were willing to purge every conspirator, no matter how powerful, if they were willing to fight their own empire for the right to rule it differently, the question was whether they had the strength for that war, and whether their partnership could survive the brutality required to win it. The investigation moved with brutal efficiency. Vaelor recovered faster than the healers predicted, driven by rage that turned pain into fuel. Within 3 days, he was upright. Within a week, he was attending interrogations personally, watching from behind mirrored glass while trained investigators broke conspirators one by one until the full scope of the treason revealed itself like infection spreading across a map. It was worse than they'd imagined. Not just Hendrik, not just a handful of ambitious nobles looking for opportunity. This was systemic, coordinated. A network of powerful men spanning military command, noble houses, and administrative bureaucracy who'd decided that female governance was an existential threat worth eliminating through any means necessary. 23 conspirators identified in the first 2 weeks, 37 by the end of month 1. The numbers kept climbing as each arrested conspirator revealed connections to others, spiderweb patterns showing how deeply the resistance ran. Selene attended every interrogation session beside Vaelor, not because she enjoyed watching men break under questioning, because she needed to understand exactly how much the Empire hated what they were building, needed to see the faces of people willing to commit treason and murder to prevent partnership from succeeding. The reasons varied, but the core motivation remained constant. Female authority threatened male dominance, power redistribution damaged entrenched interests, partnership undermined hierarchies that had sustained the empire for centuries, and men who'd spent lifetimes benefiting from those hierarchies would rather burn the kingdom than watch women rule it equally. One noble broke during interrogation and said it plainly. Queens are meant to bear heirs and host ceremonies, not govern, not make policy, not override male judgment with female sentiment. Your Majesty destroyed natural order when you elevated her. We were restoring balance. Vaelor watched through the glass with expression carved from stone. Natural order, he repeated quietly, as if male dominance is law of nature instead of construction maintained through violence and the threat of it. Selene stood beside him, feeling cold spread through her chest. They truly believe it, that women governing is abomination, that killing you is righteous act protecting the empire from corruption, which means executing them won't solve the underlying problem, Vaelor said. We can eliminate this conspiracy, but the beliefs that spawned it remain embedded in imperial culture, in laws written by men for men, in traditions teaching boys that authority is masculine and girls that obedience is virtue. He turned from the glass. We need more than purges. We need fundamental restructuring of how this empire teaches power and gender and authority. That takes generations, Selene said. Then we start now, and our children continue it. The casual mention of children hit her unexpectedly. They hadn't discussed future beyond surviving present, hadn't talked about heirs or succession or what came after they were gone. But Vaelor was thinking longer term, planning for transformation that outlasted their individual lives, building structures that would protect female rulers decades from now when he wasn't alive to defend them. The scope of it was staggering and necessary, because executing conspirators solved immediate threat but left systemic causes intact. The next generation would just produce new conspirators if the underlying culture remained unchanged. We'll need education reforms, Selene said. Curriculum changes teaching boys and girls that governance is skill, not gender. That authority comes from competence, not anatomy. Military restructuring, Vaelor added. Women in command positions, female generals, demonstration that strategic brilliance isn't masculine exclusive. Legal overhauls, removing every statute that treats women as property or restricts female authority. Cultural shifts that seem impossible until they happen. They were planning revolution disguised as governance reform, trying to dismantle centuries of patriarchal structure while maintaining enough stability to prevent empire-wide collapse. The magnitude of the task should have been paralyzing. Instead, it felt clarifying. Because sometimes the only way forward is through total transformation. Sometimes preserving what exists means accepting conditions that destroy people, and the only moral choice is burning it down and rebuilding from ash. The trials began 6 weeks after Vaelor's injury. Public proceedings in the Grand Tribunal Hall. 43 conspirators facing treason charges that carried mandatory death sentences. Evidence presented systematically. Testimonies from co-conspirators who'd turned witness in exchange for reduced sentences. Financial records tracking payments to mercenaries. Communications proving coordination. The Empire watched transfixed as its own power structure was systematically dismantled in front of them. Lord Chancellor Hendrik stood trial first. He faced the charges with aristocratic composure that nearly masked the fear beneath. Denied nothing because the evidence was overwhelming. Instead, he mounted defense based on principle rather than innocence. I acted to preserve the empire, he stated, to protect it from governance structure that violates natural law and threatens stability. Female rule invites weakness. Shared authority creates paralysis. I sought to restore proper order before damage became irreversible. Selene watched from her throne beside Vaelor's. Equal height, equal positioning, visual repudiation of everything Hendrik claimed was natural law. The prosecutor presented evidence methodically. Payments to mercenaries, communications planning the assassination, testimony from the patrol commander who'd positioned Vaelor for the attack. The tribunal deliberated less than an hour. Guilty on all counts, death by execution, sentence to be carried out within 3 days. Hendrik showed no reaction when verdict was read, just stood with spine straight and face blank as guards led him from the hall. Selene felt nothing watching him go. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just cold recognition that this was necessary. That empires willing to murder their own rulers to prevent change had to face consequences severe enough to make future conspirators reconsider. The executions would send a message. The question was whether the message would be received as warning or inspiration for next generation of resistance. 2 days before Hendrik's scheduled execution, everything went to hell. Selene was reviewing education reform proposals in her private study when the explosion shook the palace. Not close enough to damage her chambers, but loud enough to rattle windows and send servants screaming through corridors. She ran toward the sound with guards forming protective barrier around her. The East Wing was burning, flames consuming administrative offices where trial evidence was stored. Smoke pouring through hallways, making breathing painful and vision impossible. Palace guard trying to contain the blaze while evacuating staff trapped in upper floors. Selene found Vaelor in the courtyard directing fire response teams with General Cross. "What happened?" she demanded. "Sabotage," Vaelor answered without looking away from the burning wing. "Explosives planted in the evidence archives. Time to destroy trial records before executions proceed." "How many casualties?" Cross's face was grim. 12 dead so far. 20 injured. Entire administrative staff on duty in that wing. Selene felt rage boil through her veins. "Where's Hendrik?" "Still imprisoned," Cross said. "Maximum security. But we're investigating whether this was coordinated by remaining conspirators trying to destroy evidence and create chaos. It wasn't an investigation question. It was certainty. The conspiracy was larger than 43 identified members. There were others, waiting, watching the trials and calculating that their best chance was preventing executions by destroying evidence and destabilizing the proceedings. "We accelerate the executions," Selene said flatly. "Tomorrow at dawn. All convicted conspirators. Public. Simultaneous." "Your Majesty," Cross started, "the traditional protocols require—" "I don't care about traditional protocols," Selene cut him off. "Traditional protocols are what these men use to justify treason. We execute tomorrow or risk more sabotage that kills more innocent people." She looked at Vaelor. "Unless you disagree." Vaelor watched flames consuming the palace wing. His face showed the cold calculation of a king who'd conquered 5 territories through ruthless efficiency. "No," he said quietly. "You're right. We execute at dawn, all of them. Send the message that this empire will not tolerate conspiracy against the crown, regardless of how many powerful men participate." The order went out immediately. 43 executions scheduled for dawn. Public proceedings in the capital square. Mandatory attendance for all noble houses and military command. Demonstration that partnership was real, and attacking it carried consequences that didn't distinguish between chancellors and foot soldiers. That night, Selene couldn't sleep. She stood on the balcony watching crews fight the fire that was finally contained but still smoldering. Smoke rose into starless sky like offerings to gods who'd stopped listening centuries ago. Vaelor found her there near midnight. "You're thinking about tomorrow," he observed. "I'm thinking about what we're becoming," Selene answered. "What fighting for partnership is turning us into. And what are we becoming?" "People willing to execute 43 men in a single morning," she said. "People who respond to violence with greater violence. People who claim to be building something better while using methods identical to the systems we're trying to replace." Vaelor moved beside her. The fire cast orange light across half his face, leaving the other half in shadow. "You think we're becoming what we fought against?" "I think revolution and tyranny look similar from certain angles," Selene said. "Both justify violence through claims of necessity. Both silence opposition through force. Both demand absolute loyalty or death. The difference is intention," Vaelor said. "Tyrants kill to preserve their power. We're killing to protect transformation that threatens their power. The methods may appear similar, but the purpose is opposite. Does purpose excuse methodology? Selene asked. If we execute 43 people to defend partnership, are we actually defending it, or just demonstrating that female authority is as violent as male dominance? Vaelor was silent for a long moment. I don't know, he admitted finally. I don't know if there's a way to transform empire without violence. I don't know if partnership can be built without destroying the people trying to prevent it. I just know that letting them succeed means abandoning everything we've built. And if we become monsters defending it, then we become necessary monsters, Vaelor answered. The kind who understand that sometimes preserving civilization requires brutality that civilization claims to oppose. It was the most honest he'd been about the moral ambiguity of what they were attempting. Not pretending executions were purely justice, not claiming violence was righteous when directed at conspirators, just acknowledging that transformation required force, and force always corrupted even when deployed for legitimate reasons. Selene looked at the burning palace wing and understood something fundamental about power. You can't change systems without fighting the people those systems benefit. And fighting always involves methods the old system used to maintain itself. The question isn't whether transformation requires violence. It's whether the violence serves liberation or just replaces old oppression with new versions. Tomorrow would determine which they were building. Dawn came too fast. Selene dressed in formal execution attire, black and crimson, the colors of judgment and blood, heavy enough to communicate gravity of what they were about to do. Vaelor wore matching ceremonial armor despite healers' protests that his injury wasn't fully recovered. He needed to stand beside her during the executions, needed the Empire to see both rulers united in delivering justice. They walked to the Capitol Square in silence. 40,000 citizens gathered to witness. Mandatory attendance meant representatives from every noble house, every military unit, every administrative department. The Empire compressed into a single space to watch its power structure be systematically dismantled. 43 posts stood in rows across the square. Execution platforms built overnight, guards positioned at each one. The condemned were brought out under heavy escort. Lord Chancellor Hendrik first. Then the other conspirators in descending order of rank. Military commanders, noble lords, administrative officials, all stripped of titles and ceremonial decorations, all wearing plain execution robes that erased distinction between chancellor and foot soldier. In death, they were equal. The irony wasn't lost on Selene. They'd fought to preserve hierarchy, to maintain systems where rank and gender determined worth, and now they faced death that recognized neither. The charges were read publicly. Treason against the crown, conspiracy to commit regicide, sabotage resulting in civilian casualties. Evidence presented in summary form, so the watching empire understood exactly what these men had done and why they were dying for it. Hendrik was given opportunity to speak final words. He looked directly at Selene and Vaelor on the royal platform. "You think executing us ends this," he said, voice carrying across the silent square. "You think killing 43 men erases centuries of tradition. You're wrong. We're not aberration. We're empire's natural immune response to corruption. Kill us and others will rise because the fundamental truth remains unchanged. Women are not meant to rule." His voice rose. "Your partnership is abomination. Your governance structure is chaos. Your reforms are civilization's death rattle. And history will remember us as patriots who tried to save the empire from its own decay." The square was absolutely silent. 40,000 people waiting to see how their rulers would respond to defiance delivered moments before death. Selene stood and walked to the platform's edge. Her voice carried across the square without needing to shout. "You call yourselves patriots. You call partnership corruption and equality chaos, and female governance abomination. You murdered innocent palace staff and tried to assassinate your king to preserve systems that benefit you while oppressing half the empire." She let that settle. "And you believe history will vindicate you, that future generations will see your treason as righteous resistance to necessary change." Her voice hardened. "You're wrong. History will remember you as men so terrified of losing unearned power that you committed treason to preserve it. As conspirators so committed to dominance, you chose death over sharing authority. As the last generation who believed gender determined worth and tried to murder their way to maintaining that delusion." She gestured to the assembled crowd. "And this empire will remember that partnership survived your attempt to destroy it. That transformation continued despite your violence. That women ruled alongside men and the kingdom didn't collapse despite your predictions. She returned to her throne. Proceed with the executions. What happened next was efficient and brutal. Guards moved simultaneously to all 43 posts. The condemned were secured. Final rites were spoken for those who requested them. Then at precisely sunrise, the executions began. Not drawn out, not theatrical, just swift professional death delivered simultaneously across the square, so that in the span of less than 5 minutes, 43 conspirators ceased existing, and the Empire's power structure was violently reorganized. Selene watched all of it, refused to look away, refused to pretend the violence was happening somewhere she couldn't see. If she was ordering deaths to protect partnership, then she would witness every moment of what that protection cost. Beside her, Vaelor did the same, both of them understanding that this was the true price of transformation, not just political maneuvering or legislative reform, but blood and death and the brutal reality that changing empires requires killing the people invested in keeping them unchanged. The executions ended. The square remained silent. 43 bodies hanging from posts while sunrise painted the capital in shades of gold and crimson, and the empire absorbed the demonstration of what happened when you tried to murder your rulers to prevent female governance. Vaelor stood and addressed the assembled crowd. This empire is transforming, from dominance to partnership, from hierarchy to equality, from systems that benefit few at expense of many to structures that serve all citizens regardless of gender. His voice carried across 40,000 faces. Some of you believe this transformation is wrong, unnatural, dangerous to stability and tradition. You watched men you respected die today for believing that enough to commit treason. He paused. Understand this clearly. We will not stop. We will not compromise. We will not return to comfortable hierarchies where power is masculine exclusive and female authority is decorative. We will build partnership into law and culture and education until it becomes so fundamental that future generations can't imagine ruling any other way. His eyes swept the crowd. And anyone who attempts to prevent this through violence or conspiracy will face the same fate as the men who died here this morning, regardless of rank, regardless of power, regardless of how many others support them. He sat. The square began emptying slowly. 40,000 people processing what they'd witnessed and calculating how it changed their relationship to power and authority, and the rulers who'd just demonstrated they were willing to kill substantial portions of the empire's leadership to protect transformation. Selene remained seated until the last citizens departed. Then she stood and walked from the platform without looking back at the 43 bodies that would hang in the square for 3 days as continued warning. She made it to the palace entrance before her legs gave out. Vaelor caught her before she hit the ground, held her while she shook with reaction to what they'd just done. The magnitude of the violence, the weight of the deaths, the terrible recognition that they'd become exactly what Hendrik accused them of being, rulers willing to kill anyone who threatened their authority. The fact that their authority served partnership instead of dominance didn't change the fundamental truth that they'd just executed 43 people and would execute 43 more if necessary to maintain power. We're monsters, she whispered against Vaelor's chest. We're rulers, he corrected quietly. And ruling always requires becoming partially monstrous. The question is whether the monstrousness serves transformation or oppression. How do we know which? We keep checking, Vaelor said. Keep questioning whether our violence is necessary or excessive. Keep examining whether we're building partnership or just replacing old tyranny with new versions. Keep remembering that the moment we stop asking those questions is the moment we become what we're fighting against. They stood in the palace entrance while dawn light spread across the capital and smoke from the still smoldering east wing drifted through air that tasted like ash and blood, and the terrible cost of attempting to change empire from the inside. The executions were over. But the real fight was just beginning, because killing conspirators eliminated immediate threat, but didn't change the culture that produced them. Didn't alter the beliefs teaching boys that authority was masculine and girls that governance was abomination. That work would take years, decades, generations of sustained effort, maintaining transformation against constant resistance from people who benefited from old systems and would fight to restore them. And Selene stood there understanding with brutal clarity that she'd committed herself to a war that would consume the rest of her life and probably outlast it. The question was whether she had the strength for that fight, whether she could maintain partnership while becoming the kind of ruthless, necessary monster that transformation apparently required. Whether she could execute conspirators and reform education and restructure military and overhaul legal systems and survive the constant grinding effort of defending female authority against empire that hated it. Vaelor's arms tightened around her. "We do this together," he said quietly. "Not you carrying everything while I conquer elsewhere. Both of us fighting side by side for as long as it takes. And if we fail, then we fail having tried everything possible," Vaelor answered. "But I don't think we'll fail. I think we'll build something that outlasts us and protects rulers who come after from having to fight the same battles." Selene pulled back enough to see his face. "You really believe that?" "I have to," Vaelor said, "because the alternative is accepting that empires can't change, and partnership is impossible, and we executed 43 people for nothing." He touched her face gently. "I believe we can build something better. Something that proves transformation is possible even in kingdoms designed to resist it. Something worth the terrible cost we're paying." Selene looked into eyes that had seen conquest and betrayal and transformation and now held something that looked like hope despite everything they'd just done. And she made her choice, not because the path was clear or the outcome certain or the cost manageable, but because some fights are worth fighting even when they destroy the people waging them. Because empires that execute rulers to prevent female governance need exactly the kind of violent transformation Vaelor and Selene were attempting. Because partnership built on blood and defended through death might actually be the only kind that survives in kingdoms where dominance was law for centuries. The palace bells began ringing, calling council to emergency session to address the power vacuum created by executing significant portions of the empire's leadership. 43 positions needed filling, military command restructured, noble houses reorganized, administrative departments rebuilt. The work was staggering, and it started now. Selene straightened her spine and stepped away from Vaelor's embrace. "Let's go build an empire," she said. Together, Vaelor agreed. They walked toward the council chambers side by side, while behind them smoke rose from the burning palace wing and 43 bodies hung in the capital square, and the empire held its breath, wondering whether what came next would be transformation or just tyranny with different faces. The answer would determine everything, whether partnership could survive the violence required to defend it, whether female authority could be established permanently or would always require masculine protection to maintain, whether empires built on centuries of dominance could actually transform into something that recognized equality as strength instead of weakness. The council chamber doors stood open ahead, and Queen Selene Ardyn walked through them beside King Vaelor Draven, knowing that the hardest battles were still coming, and the real test wasn't executing conspirators, but building systems that prevented future generations from needing similar violence. The climax had passed, but the resolution remained uncertain, and everything they'd fought for hung in balance, waiting to discover if transformation was possible or if they'd just replaced old oppression with new versions that looked different but functioned identically. The Empire watched, waited, and prepared for whatever came next in the aftermath of the bloodiest dawn the capital had witnessed in 3 generations. The council chamber felt different after the executions, not physically. The same marble floors, the same oak table worn smooth by centuries of governance decisions, the same windows overlooking gardens where spring was slowly replacing winter's dead landscape with green shoots that didn't care about human violence. But the atmosphere had transformed completely. 43 empty seats where conspirators used to sit. 43 absences that changed the chamber's entire dynamic. Power vacuums so profound that every remaining council member understood they were witnessing either the birth of something revolutionary or the Empire's slow collapse into chaos. Selene sat in her throne beside Vaelor's and watched new council members file in. Replacements chosen carefully over 3 weeks of deliberation. Not just competent administrators. People who demonstrated commitment to partnership through actions, not just convenient words. Women in positions previously held exclusively by men. Younger officials promoted over senior ones because age didn't guarantee wisdom, and sometimes fresh perspectives mattered more than entrenched experience. The composition itself was statement. 15 council members, 8 men, 7 women. Ratio that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago when Selene first returned to the palace. Now it was law. Mandated gender balance written into imperial governance structure, so future rulers couldn't revert to male-dominated councils even if they wanted to. General Cross remained. One of the few original members who'd survived scrutiny and demonstrated genuine commitment to transformation instead of just performing loyalty while waiting for old systems to reassert themselves. He stood when everyone was seated. Your Majesties, the council is assembled. Shall we begin? Vaelor gestured to Selene. The Queen will open today's session. It was deliberate choice, demonstration that partnership meant actual power sharing, not just ceremonial deference. That Selene's authority to lead council sessions was equal to his and would be exercised regularly instead of reserved for special occasions. She stood and addressed the council with voice that carried weight of everything they'd survived to reach this moment. We gather today to rebuild what conspiracy attempted to destroy, not just replacing executed officials, but fundamentally restructuring how this empire governs itself so that partnership becomes permanent instead of dependent on individual rulers' choices. She opened the ledger before her. First priority is education reform. Curriculum changes teaching children that governance is skill, not gender. That authority comes from competence, not anatomy. That partnership is strength, not weakness. The new education minister stood. A woman named Petra Voss, who'd spent 20 years teaching in border provinces where practical necessity had already eroded some gender restrictions. Your Majesty, we've drafted comprehensive reforms. Primary education mandating equal instruction for boys and girls. Secondary curriculum including governance studies for all students regardless of gender. University access expanded to women in fields previously restricted. Timeline for implementation, Selene asked. 3 years for primary reforms, 5 for secondary, 10 for full university integration. Too slow, Selene said bluntly. We need faster transformation or risk backsliding before changes take root. Compress timeline to 2 years primary, 3 secondary, 5 university. Increase funding whatever necessary to achieve it. Minister Voss nodded. It can be done with sufficient resources. You'll have them, Vaelor interjected. Education is foundational. Everything else depends on raising generations who can't imagine governance without partnership. The session continued for hours. Military restructuring creating pathways for women into command positions. Legal reforms removing statutes treating women as property or restricting female authority. Economic policies incentivizing businesses that demonstrated gender equality in hiring and promotion. Piece by piece, they were dismantling centuries of systemic discrimination and rebuilding institutional frameworks that assumed partnership instead of hierarchy. The work was exhausting. Every decision faced resistance from somewhere. Noble houses who lost traditional privileges. Military commanders uncomfortable reporting to female superiors. Merchants who'd built fortunes exploiting legal restrictions on women's economic participation. But the executions had created space for change that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Fear is powerful motivator, and watching 43 powerful men die for opposing partnership made resisting transformation considerably less appealing for people who valued their lives more than their prejudices. Selene understood they were using terror to achieve goals. That frightening people into accepting equality wasn't the same as convincing them it was right. But perfect methods didn't exist, and sometimes forcing compliance preceded genuine acceptance. The council session ended near sunset. Members filed out looking exhausted but energized. The peculiar combination that happens when people are doing difficult work they believe actually matters. Selene remained in her throne after the chamber emptied. Vaelor dismissed the guards, so they were alone in the space where so much had been broken and rebuilt and broken again before finally taking shape as something that might actually survive. You're thinking about whether this will last, he observed. Selene looked at him. I'm thinking about what happens when we're gone, whether the structures we're building are strong enough to survive rulers who don't share our commitment to partnership. It's why we're embedding it so deeply, Vaelor said, making partnership legal requirement instead of personal choice, teaching it to children before they learn hierarchy, building it into military and economic systems so thoroughly that dismantling it would require destroying the empire. And if that's not enough, then we accept that some transformations fail, Vaelor answered, but we've given it the best chance possible. created legal frameworks and cultural shifts and institutional changes that make reverting to old systems harder than maintaining new ones. He stood and moved to the window. I used to think legacy was about territories conquered, land claimed, enemies defeated, monuments with my name carved into stone that would outlast my lifetime. He turned back to her. But standing here now, after everything we've survived and fought for and built together, I understand legacy differently. It's not about what I conquered, it's about what we created. Systems that protect people I'll never meet from suffering we experienced. Structures that make partnership possible for rulers who come after us. That's the legacy worth dying for. Selene stood and joined him at the window. Below them, the capital was recovering. Construction crews rebuilding the destroyed East Wing. Merchants reopening shops near the execution square. Life continuing despite violence that had seemed apocalyptic while happening, but became just another chapter in the Empire's long, brutal history. Civilizations are resilient in ways that terrify me, she said quietly. They absorb atrocities and keep functioning. Normalize violence and move forward. 43 people died, and within weeks the Empire treats it like unfortunate necessity instead of catastrophic moral failure. Is it moral failure if the deaths serve transformation? Vaelor asked. I don't know anymore, Selene admitted. I've lost certainty about what's justified and what's just brutality disguised as progress. We executed people to defend partnership, destroyed lives to build systems meant to protect life. The contradiction breaks something in me every time I examine it too closely. Vaelor's hand found hers. Then we carry that breaking together. Share the moral weight instead of one person bearing it alone. That's what partnership means. Not just sharing authority, but sharing the cost of exercising it. They stood in silence while sunset painted the city in shades of gold and shadow, and the particular quality of light that makes everything look simultaneously beautiful and temporary. I need to tell you something, Selene said finally. Vaelor waited. I'm pregnant. The words fell into the quiet chamber like stones into still water. Vaelor went absolutely motionless. How long have you known? 3 weeks. Since before the executions. She touched her still flat stomach. I didn't tell you because I didn't want it influencing decisions we needed to make about the conspiracy. Didn't want you protecting me differently because I'm carrying your heir. Our heir, Vaelor corrected quietly. And you're right. I would have treated you differently, would have tried to keep you away from danger, would have prioritized your safety over strategic necessity. Which is exactly why I didn't tell you, Selene said. Because partnership means neither of us gets to make unilateral decisions about what risks are acceptable, even when one of us is pregnant. Vaelor's hand moved to her stomach. Reverent, terrified. Are you scared? Absolutely, Selene answered. I'm terrified of bringing a child into Empire we've destabilized through transformation. Terrified of what happens if conspiracies resurface and target our family. Terrified of failing as parent the way I nearly failed as queen. But also, her voice softened, also hopeful that this child grows up in Empire where partnership is normal, where gender doesn't determine worth or limit potential, where queens rule alongside kings and nobody questions whether female authority is legitimate. That's the Empire we're building, Vaelor said. For them. For all the children who come after who deserve better than what we inherited. They stood together in the darkening chamber while new life grew between them and the city recovered below and the Empire continued its painful transformation toward something that might actually deserve to survive. The months that followed were simultaneously brutal and hopeful. Reforms moved forward despite constant resistance. Education curriculum changed. Military restructured. Legal statutes overturned. Every victory hard-fought and incomplete, but collectively adding up to transformation that was becoming visible across the Empire. Selene's pregnancy progressed through summer into autumn. She continued governing throughout. Attended council sessions until the day before she gave birth. Refused to let pregnancy become excuse for reduced authority or protective restrictions on her participation. The Empire watched their queen rule visibly pregnant and absorbed new lesson about female capacity. That women could grow life and govern simultaneously, that motherhood and authority weren't mutually exclusive, that pregnancy was natural biological process, not medical crisis requiring removal from public sphere. Labor began during Autumn Harvest Festival. Selene was reviewing grain storage projections when her water broke in the middle of council session. She finished her presentation before allowing healers to escort her to birthing chambers because the grain crisis wouldn't pause for biological convenience, and partnership meant completing responsibilities even when personally inconvenient. Vaelor followed her to the birthing chambers looking more terrified than she'd ever seen him on battlefield. "I don't know how to help," he admitted. "You can't help," Selene said through gritted teeth as contraction hit. "This part I do alone. But you can stay and witness what women endure to create life. See the cost that half the empire pays that the other half will never experience." He stayed through 18 hours of labor, watched Selene scream and bleed and push life into world through process that looked like dying before it resolved into birth. Saw firsthand the violence that female bodies endure and survive, the strength required to bring children into existence, and understood something fundamental about power he'd never grasped during 30 years of conquest and rule, that physical dominance was hollow compared to capacity to create life, that the alpha strength he'd been trained to value was meaningless next to ability to grow human being inside your body and survive delivering it into world, that women were stronger than any king in ways that mattered more than territorial control or military victories. The baby was daughter, small and screaming and perfect in her terrifying fragility. They named her Selene Ardyn Draven, both house names. Both bloodlines acknowledged equally in title that would have been impossible 6 months ago when only paternal lineage mattered. Selene held her daughter and felt something shift fundamentally in her understanding of why they were fighting. Not abstract principles about equality or political philosophy about governance structures. This specific child who would grow up an empire they were building, who would inherit partnership or hierarchy, depending on whether transformation survived long enough to become permanent. Every reform suddenly felt more urgent, every resistance more dangerous, every compromise more costly, because this wasn't just about them anymore. It was about every child who came after, every girl who deserved to grow up believing she could rule, every boy who needed to learn that partnership was strength. Vaelor stood beside the bed looking at his daughter with expression of wonder and terror. "I don't know how to protect her," he said quietly. "You can't protect her from everything," Selene answered. "But you can build empire where she's safer than we were, where female authority is normal, where partnership is assumed, where she never has to fight the battles we fought just to be seen. That's the protection that matters." Winter came early again. Lyra was 3 months old when the second conspiracy surfaced, smaller than the first, only 8 conspirators, but coordinated and dangerous and specifically targeting Selene while she was still recovering from childbirth and theoretically vulnerable. They underestimated her. The conspiracy was uncovered before it moved from planning to action, participants arrested, evidence gathered, trials conducted with same efficiency as before, but this time Selene presided over the proceedings alone. Vaelor was inspecting northern border defenses, intentional absence, demonstration that Selene's authority didn't require his presence to be legitimate. She sentenced all 8 conspirators to death, watched them executed in Capitol Square while holding her daughter and teaching her first lesson about empire and power and the cost of maintaining transformation against constant resistance. Some might say that was cruel, exposing infant to violence, teaching child that death was appropriate response to opposition. But Selene understood something about ruling that couldn't be taught gently, that power required hard choices, that protecting civilization sometimes meant destroying people threatening it, that leadership wasn't ceremonial decoration, but brutal ongoing work of maintaining structures against people who wanted them dismantled. And if her daughter was going to rule someday, she needed to understand that reality from the beginning instead of learning it painfully later when illusions shattered. The conspiracy's failure sent different message than the first ones. First conspiracy proved partnership could survive when both rulers defended it. Second conspiracy proved partnership survived even when only one ruler was present. That Selene's authority was real and permanent and didn't require masculine protection to maintain. The distinction mattered, because systemic change only succeeds when it becomes independent of individual people, when structures hold regardless of who occupies positions of power. And the Empire was learning that partnership was structure now. Not just Vaelor and Selene's personal arrangement, but foundational governance principle that transcended their individual rule. 5 years passed, Lyra grew into child who asked why some books said only boys could be kings, until her mother explained those books were old and wrong and being replaced with better ones. The education reforms took root. Entire generation of children learning partnership as normal, growing up unable to imagine governance without female authority because they'd never experienced empire any other way. Military transformation produced first female generals, women commanding troops and winning battles and demonstrating that strategic brilliance had nothing to do with anatomy. Legal reforms eliminated most remaining statutes restricting women's rights. Economic policies created incentives powerful enough that even resistant merchants found equality more profitable than discrimination. The changes accumulated, not perfectly, not without resistance, not without ongoing fights against people who wanted old systems restored, but persistently, directionally, building momentum that made reversal increasingly difficult because too many people benefited from new structures to allow easy return to old hierarchies. Selene and Vaelor governed together through it all, not without conflict. They disagreed regularly about implementation timelines and resource allocation and how to balance transformation against stability. But the disagreements happened between equals. Neither dominated the other, neither disappeared while staying, neither had to choose between being seen and being safe. They'd built real partnership, imperfect, incomplete, requiring constant maintenance and defense, but real. On winter evening in the 5th year of transformed empire, Selene stood on familiar balcony watching capitals sleep beneath stars that looked closer than they had years ago when she'd stood in same place wondering whether she should stay or flee. Vaelor found her there. He was graying now, lines around his eyes from stress and age and the accumulated weight of 5 years defending transformation against constant resistance. But his presence still filled space the way it always had when he stopped performing restraint. "You're thinking about before," he observed. Selene smiled slightly. "I'm thinking about distance traveled, about woman who fled this palace 6 years ago because staying was destroying her, about king who believed conquest was legacy and partnership was weakness. And what do you see when you think about them? People who were breaking," Selene said, "who'd built relationship on hierarchy and possession and the terrible assumption that love survived neglect if you just endured long enough." She turned from the railing. "I'm grateful we survived our own destruction, that we learned before it was too late, that we built something better from ruins we created." Vaelor moved beside her. "I'm grateful you left, that you had courage to walk away when staying would have killed you, that you came back only when I'd proven transformation was real." He touched her face gently. "And I'm grateful you trusted me again, despite every reason not to, despite the risk, despite knowing I might fail you." "You haven't failed me," Selene said. "Not yet," Vaelor corrected. "But we both know transformation is ongoing work, not completed achievement. That I could still revert to old patterns. The partnership requires constant vigilance and recommitment." "Then we stay vigilant together," Selene answered. "Keep checking each other. Keep questioning whether we're maintaining partnership or sliding into comfortable hierarchies. Keep remembering that the moment we stop actively choosing equality is the moment we lose it." Lyra appeared in the doorway, 5 years old and already demonstrating the peculiar combination of her mother's strategic mind and her father's stubborn intensity. "Why are you outside?" she asked. "It's cold. We're talking about empire," Vaelor said. Lyra climbed onto the balcony railing between them. "Can I help rule when I'm bigger?" "You'll have to," Selene answered. "That's what heirs do. They continue the work their parents started and build on what came before. Will I rule alone like old books say, or with partner like you and father?" "With partner," Vaelor said firmly. "That's law now. No ruler governs alone. Partnership is mandatory." "Even if I don't want partner?" Lyra asked. "Even then," Selene confirmed. "Because individual preference matters less than structural protection. We're not building empire that depends on rulers choosing partnership. We're building empire where partnership is only option." Lyra considered this with 5-year-old seriousness. "That seems smart. One person can't know everything." "Exactly," Vaelor said, "which is why we changed how empire works. So people like you can rule without having to fight battles we fought just to be seen." They stood together on the balcony while winter wind carried sounds of city that had survived transformation and was slowly accepting it as new normal instead of temporary aberration. And Selene understood something about legacy that she hadn't fully grasped during all the executions and reforms and brutal ongoing work of defending partnership. That success wasn't measured in years or even decades. It was measured in children who couldn't imagine empire any other way, in generations who would inherit partnership as assumption and build from that foundation toward futures she couldn't predict. The real victory wasn't winning fights they'd fought. It was making those fights unnecessary for people who came after. "Tell me story," Lyra demanded. Selene gathered her daughter close. "What kind of story? The one about Queen who disappeared and King who learned to see her?" "It's long story," Vaelor warned. "I like long stories," Lyra insisted. Selene and Vaelor exchanged glances. Years of partnership compressed into single look that communicated entire conversations without words. Then Selene began. "Once there was empire built on bloodline and dominance and fear, and Queen who held it together while King chased glory without noticing foundation beneath him. And when she finally walked away, the entire kingdom learned what they'd been taking for granted. She continued the story while stars wheeled overhead and cities slept, and her daughter listened with absolute attention to tale of transformation and betrayal and the brutal ongoing work of building partnership and empire designed to resist it. And when the story ended, Lyra asked the question that mattered most. Did they live happily ever after? Selene considered how to answer truthfully without destroying childhood illusions. "They lived," she said finally. "They fought and struggled and disagreed and made mistakes. They executed people who opposed them and made brutal choices defending transformation. They became partially monstrous in service of building something better." She touched her daughter's face. "But they stayed partners. Through everything, and they built empire where you can grow up believing governance is shared. Where gender doesn't determine worth. Where partnership is normal instead of revolutionary." "That's not exactly happy," Lyra observed. "No," Vaelor agreed. "But it's real. And real is more valuable than happy, because real is what you can build on." Lyra yawned, her head drooped against Selene's shoulder. "I think I understand." "Good," Selene said quietly, "because someday you'll rule this empire. And when you do, I want you to remember that partnership isn't easy. It requires constant work and brutal choices and willingness to fight your own instincts toward comfortable hierarchy. But it's worth it," Lyra mumbled, half asleep, "because one person can't know everything." "Exactly," Selene whispered. She carried her daughter inside and settled her in bed while Vaelor watched from the doorway with expression of wonder that hadn't faded in 5 years of fatherhood. "She'll be good ruler," he said quietly. "She'll be better than we were," Selene corrected, "because she'll inherit structures we built instead of starting from hierarchy we had to dismantle. She'll face different challenges, but she won't have to fight for basic legitimacy the way I did. That's the gift we're giving her, foundation solid enough to build from, instead of unstable ground we started on." They left Lyra sleeping and returned to their own chambers. Selene stood before the mirror that had shown her stranger 6 years ago when she'd been disappearing queen trapped in marriage that was slowly killing her. The woman looking back now was different, older, harder, marked by 5 years of brutal choices and constant fighting and the accumulated weight of transforming empire while raising child and maintaining partnership. But also stronger, more certain, no longer wondering if she deserved the crown or the authority or the space she occupied. She knew her worth now, not because anyone told her, but because she'd proven it through sustained governance and defense of structures and willingness to execute people who threatened transformation. The price had been steep, innocence destroyed, moral certainty eroded, sleep sacrificed to endless vigilance against conspiracies and resistance. But standing here now, looking at woman who'd survived everything empire threw at her and emerged with partnership intact, Selene understood something fundamental about power. That it wasn't given. It was taken and defended and maintained through brutal ongoing work that never ended, but was worth doing anyway. That transformation required violence, but violence alone didn't make transformation. That partnership survived not because it was easy, but because they chose it repeatedly, despite constant temptation toward comfortable hierarchy. Vaelor appeared behind her in the mirror. "No regrets?" he asked. Selene considered this. Thousands of regrets. Every person executed. Every choice that required becoming partially monstrous. Every time we chose empire over mercy. But also no regrets. Because the alternative was abandoning transformation, letting old systems reassert themselves. Raising our daughter an empire that treated women as decorative property instead of legitimate rulers. She turned from the mirror. I regret the cost. I regret what defending partnership required us to become. But I don't regret the outcome. And I'll keep paying the cost however long necessary to protect what we built. Vaelor pulled her close. Then we pay it together. For however long it takes. Until partnership is so deeply embedded that future rulers can't dismantle it without destroying the empire. They stood in their chambers while the palace slept around them, and 5 years of transformation settled into foundation that might actually hold against the pressures that would inevitably come. Because empires don't change permanently in single generation. They shift slowly across decades and centuries as new normal becomes so established that old systems seem foreign and impossible to restore. And Selene and Vaelor were building foundation for that long transformation. Not perfect, not complete, not immune to backsliding or failure, but real, substantive, possibly strong enough to survive them and continue evolving toward futures they couldn't predict but had done everything possible to make viable. That was legacy, not monuments with names carved in stone, not territories conquered or enemies defeated, but structures that protected people who came after from suffering they'd experienced, systems that made partnership possible for rulers who inherited them. Foundations solid enough that their daughter and her children and generations beyond could build upward instead of constantly fighting for basic legitimacy. Years later, when historians studied the transformation of the Vaelor Empire, they would identify this period as the pivot point, the moment when partnership shifted from revolutionary experiment to established governance structure. When female authority became normal instead of exceptional. When systems changed enough that reverting to old hierarchies required more effort than maintaining new ones. They would write books analyzing the reforms, debating whether the executions were justified, arguing about whether transformation happened too quickly or too slowly. But they would agree on one fundamental point, that Queen Selene Ardyn and King Vaelor Draven had changed the empire permanently, that their partnership survived because they built structures stronger than individual virtue, that their legacy was measured not in years but in generations who inherited better foundation than they'd started with. And standing in their chambers that winter night, Selene and Vaelor didn't know how history would judge them. They just knew they'd survived their own destruction and built something better from the ruins, that they'd fought for partnership when fighting seemed impossible, that they'd paid brutal prices and become partially monstrous and made choices that would haunt them forever. But they'd done it together, as equals. As partners, as rulers who'd learned that true strength wasn't domination, but willingness to share power even when sharing cost everything. The empire slept beneath stars that wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles and transformations, and the constant painful work of building civilizations that deserved to survive. And two people who'd broken each other and rebuilt themselves and their empire stood together in the darkness, knowing the fight would never truly end but was worth fighting anyway. Because some transformations take lifetimes. Some battles require generations. Some partnerships are built not through easy harmony, but through brutal ongoing choice to keep choosing partnership even when hierarchy would be more comfortable. And empires that survive are the ones that learn before it's too late. That power without awareness becomes destruction, and dominance without respect becomes cruelty, and crowns are heavy. Not because of gold, but because they constantly tempt rulers to believe they're entitled to devotion they've stopped earning. The palace bells struck midnight. A new day beginning. Another opportunity to defend and maintain and build upon the transformation they'd started. Selene and Vaelor held each other in the darkness and made silent promises they'd made 1,000 times before and would make 1,000 times again. To stay partners. To keep fighting. To defend the structures they'd built with blood and brutal choices. To raise their daughter an empire where she never had to question whether she deserved the crown simply because she was born female. To build legacy measured not in monuments but in generations who inherited better foundation. To survive themselves and their own worst instincts and the constant grinding pressure to revert to comfortable hierarchies. To prove that transformation was possible even in kingdoms designed to resist it. And somewhere in the sleeping capital, in homes and barracks and noble estates, the empire continued its slow, painful evolution toward future that looked nothing like past it was leaving behind. The story was far from over. But standing here, in this moment, Selene understood that some endings are really just transformed beginnings. That the queen who'd disappeared 6 years ago was gone forever. That the king who'd conquered 5 territories while neglecting his foundation had become someone else entirely. That they'd built partnership from betrayal, an empire from ashes, and legacy from brutal ongoing work of choosing equality even when dominance would have been easier. And that was enough. Not perfect, not complete, not immune to failure, but enough to hope that what came after would be better than what came before. Enough to believe transformation was possible. Enough to keep fighting for partnership against empire that would resist forever. Enough.